Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Face the Change in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 11. The old Nekoba kept repeating how nice it was to see them after so long, how she couldn't believe how much Sasuke had grown, kept asking how he was, what he had been up to. She wasn't trying to make him feel guilty, which was why it was working so well. He couldn't even remember the last time he had visited Soraku. Surely because he had not known then that it would be the last, it must have been just an ordinary visit, boring and tiresome. He must have wanted to go back to Konoha, to train with Naruto and Sakura, to hang out with his cousins or to pester Itachi. He must have grumbled and asked why he had to come. The next time, he had managed to wriggle out of it for one reason or another. And the next, and the next. And now it was years later and the old woman was happy to see him, and he felt guilty. A little betrayed too, because Itachi didn't get the same treatment at all, and he was just discovering this now, he had kept visiting regularly, mission or not. He had stopped asking Sasuke but kept coming on his own, helping the old woman around and spending time with the cats. Sasuke knew it was unfair of him to be upset, since he had been the one to shun the trips in the first place, but still. Itachi could have tried again. Could have guessed Sasuke would change his mind as he grew older. There was one thing that made up for it all though. If old Nekoba was quite indulgent with Sasuke, the same couldn't be said for their father. You think sending your sons for you is enough, huh? Years you've ignored me, years. Are you not the head of the Uchiha clan? Don't you have duties to uphold? Best thing was, his father looked properly chastised, taking the remonstrance without complaints. The old woman was exaggerating for sure, theatrical as old people knew to be, almost affectionate in her scolding, and his father seemed both repentant and weirdly pleased. I'm sorry, grandmother, he said, bowing deeply. I am at fault. Please forgive me. Sasuke figured he was missing something there. His father had to review the weapon stocks and talk about security and other boring things surely. Sasuke was usually dutiful to follow this kind of thing, as Tsunade always grilled him to learn as much as he could, everywhere and at every opportunity. But Soraku wasn't Konoha. It was out of his life there, a parenthesis, untouched by most of the events of his life. Seeing his father here was unsettling enough, he didn't want to demystify it further, for it to come down to just another thing to be taken care of, just another responsibility to shoulder. Above all, Soraku had always been a playground. So he wandered off, refamiliarizing himself with the maze of corridors and narrow streets, of stairs, and abandoned rooms spiraling up above and down below the ground, much wider and intricate than it appeared at first glance. It was easy to get lost in it, but Sasuke had run up and down these paths hundreds of times, he could navigate it easily still. It was reassuring. He stopped here and there to pet the cats and try to unearth spots he and Itachi and the few cousins that had accompanied them sometimes had tagged with red paint as a supreme act of rebellious fun. A time-honored tradition of all the Uchiha youth who came, years after years, on their parents' orders. Silly drawings and quotes from songs and movies, more or less faded on the crumbling walls and rusting pipes. He found Asahi and Fugaku carved in the wood of an old door. Asahi was his father's young brother, killed during the Third War before Sasuke was born. Even Itachi had no memory of him, and their father never talked about him. As he didn't talk about most things, didn't talk at all. In another corridor he found the neat script of Kamui claiming he was bored and couldn't wait to go home. The little cat head scratched underneath, it had to be Kara's doing. Sasuke wondered if years from now other children of the Uchiha clan would walk Soraku too, if they would ponder at those inscriptions. If they would find Sasuke and Itachi's scribbles and attach them to the stern adults in their lives. If they too would lament at dead brothers. He went back to Nekoba's quarters after that, anxious suddenly to see Itachi, to escape the ghosts. He knew they were the ones to write on the walls, but he couldn't even remember it for good. Childhood seemed far away already. Not far enough though, when he saw what the adults were doing. Tamaki, he exclaimed, mortified. Why did you have to pull that out? Take it back. The girl giggled, blushing lightly, and of course made no move to retrieve the small book that Nekoba was reviewing with his father. He recognized it immediately. Itachi was sharpening kunao in a corner, as he knew the content of the book already. It's nothing to be embarrassed about, Sasuke, his father said, a little puzzled, which made it all the more embarrassing. He turned another page, adorned with another paw print. The book probably contained the prints of all the cats older than 5 living in Soraku. Sasuke didn't remember what Itachi could have said to him, to convince him that collecting those was of the utmost importance. It didn't matter much to him as a child anyway, he was eager to do anything Itachi asked of him, eager to please him and make him proud in whatever way. It might have counted even more than their father's approval. Sasuke could bear without his father's attention as long as he had Itachi's, but not the other way around. He was quite proud of the book at the time, but he understood how silly it was now, just something Itachi came up with to placate Sasuke as he complained and whined that he didn't want to be there. Granted, it had worked. For a while he had even looked forward to visiting Soraku, just to further his collection. I didn't know you kept it, he grumbled, joining the old woman with the vague hope to snatch the book when she wasn't looking. Tamaki smiled at him. We weren't going to just throw it away. His father was absorbed in the book for reasons Sasuke couldn't figure out. It wasn't the kind of thing the man ever had an interest in, neither Sasuke nor Itachi had ever told him about it. They hadn't told anyone, it was their thing, that stayed in Soraku, a harmless secret that still felt weird to be exposed like this to their father's scrutinizing eyes. Sasuke focused on Jiji climbing on his shoulder to distract himself from the stupid book, though it soon appeared that it was also what interested the cat at the moment. Don't tell me you want in, Sasuke sighed. The judgmental look he got back was answer enough. Nekoba was only too happy to go fetch some ink. Jiji jumped on her laps, pleased with himself and despite Sasuke's weak protests. Tamaki felt his discomfort maybe, because she suggested they made a round check of the traps laid around the city to help defend it and its resources. Sasuke was happy to follow her out. Tamaki was a year older than him, but they had never become proper friends. Sasuke was rather particular as a child, especially before the academy. He seldom interacted with people outside the clan and had no friend that weren't Uchiha. Naruto, and then Sakura, were the exceptions for a long time. Tamaki was friendly and welcoming, but he never really gave her a chance. They checked the traps, even if it was an excuse, it still had to be done properly. He wondered if Tamaki ever got bored or lonely, out here alone but for her grandmother, their many cats, and the occasional travelers. He didn't know how to ask, didn't exactly care to. He was always bad at this. Maybe he had kept his distance for fear he wouldn't manage to befriend her anyway. Next time we'll meet in Konoha, she said after a few minutes of Sasuke turning various questions and conversation topics over in his head. Yeah. I should visit soon, if the old woman agrees. Maybe you can show me around. I'm pretty busy, he admitted. When he wasn't working at the hospital or training, he mostly lazed around the flat, tired out of his mind and fed up with company. She faltered, a little disappointed. He had said the wrong thing. But don't worry, I can ask some friends. You won't be alone. She nodded but didn't seem all that reassured. He had an idea maybe of why she was distraught. He remembered how girls would fight for a chance to sit next to him in class or walk home with him after school. He doubted she would be like that and he didn't want to presume, but it was a thing, right? It happened more and more around him. Not to him but others. He tried to picture it, walking her around the village, taking her out to eat and drink at the outdoor stalls in popular cafe. He would have to hold her hand, right? Smile, talk. Look at her. She was rather pretty, he supposed. They would probably get along well. Yet he couldn't see it. Couldn't see, couldn't feel. He didn't see the appeal. It felt more a hassle than anything else. He preferred to hang around people that were fine with him not participating in the conversation, not always being quite there with them and not demanding him to be. Often when they had friends over at the apartment he would stay quiet in his corner of the couch, soaking in their presence as they chattered and laughed, and it was enough for him. They kept up a good rhythm at their task at least. She didn't seem that sad, so he figured he had not been too harsh, this time. Nekoba was busy making dinner when they went back. His father announced they would spend the night and leave early the next morning. If there were no pressing matters, if they felt like it, they would stop again in Soraku on their way back. Suzuki took the opportunity to sleep surrounded by cats, to Jiji's ostensible displeasure. I didn't know about that book, Suzuki's father said, out of the blue, about 3 hours after they had left Soraku for the capital. Suzuki had been anticipating it all morning. Both Itaki and their father had this air about them when they were preparing to say something but didn't dare to yet. Their mother said Suzuki did the same. She said it was funny how they were alike in that regard. It made for tense, awkward, and heavy silence that could stretch for hours before they finally got on with it. Itaki was undoubtedly the worst at this and the only one who could, after several hours or even days, end up not saying anything at all. It was just to pass the time, Suzuki answered vaguely. What else would you do? What? To pass the time. Suzuki didn't even know what to say to that, uncomfortable with his father's sudden interest in their life. The best strategy was not to say anything at all and wait until he got the hint, but for some reason Itaki had decided to play along today. We trained, mostly. We challenged each other to reach increasingly difficult targets with kunai or shuriken. We made a contest out of tailing members of the clan around the village without getting caught. It was a popular game among the children, though Suzuki was sure he had never played it with Itaki. It made sense he had the same games with the other Uchiha his age. They didn't play with children outside the clan then, and they didn't take the risk of following adults who weren't of their own either. Another one of those things that weren't explicit rules yet they all followed anyway. Their father hummed, as if approving. Suzuki had no idea where this conversation was supposed to go. When I was your age, the game was to paint the symbol of the Uchiha clan in the most impressive places possible. In his surprise, Suzuki forgot to be reluctant. Really? High on walls and roofs, or in places we weren't allowed to go. We got into a lot of trouble for it too. Suzuki honestly couldn't picture it. Trying to imagine his father any younger than he was now was already a struggle. There were a few pictures, when Itaki was young, on their parents' wedding day, when Fugaku was a Chunin, but the man in those pictures never looked like Suzuki's father. It was someone else surely, someone who was young and could smile, could be cheerful and funny. Same went with his mother's stories of their youth and mischiefs. It was unfathomable. And yet he was dying to know more. There is an Uchiha fan on top of the lamppost in front of the academy. Was that you? His father smiled the faint, painful smile that meant whatever the memory and no matter how happy it had been once, it was then tarnished by darker circumstances, probably death. My brother, that explained it. I'm curious how you even spotted that one. We tried to cross the whole village once without touching the ground, with. Suzuki stumbled upon the name, he bit his tongue, irritated. He didn't want to ruin whatever strange dispositions his father was in, but if the man decided to get angry, how was it Suzuki's fault? With Naruto. He glared at his father, daring him to make a comment, to voice his opinion on the matter. The long pause that followed was unnatural in the flow of the conversation, heavy with recrimination. But then. And who won? The next pause was even longer. Suzuki fumbled with the answer, caught off guard, and he thought his father looked a little smug about it. I did. He tripped on a clothing line and got chased around by an old lady, so he had to come down and hide for a while. His father smiled, however faint, and for once the memory wasn't as bitter, as wistful. It had been a good day, full of mischief and laughter. Even that women had only yelled about misbehaving children with no education nor manners, unaware or uncaring of Naruto's identity, unlike most adults they dealt with at the time. They had ended up sprawled out in the field near the Uchiha district, breathless and exhausted, content to soak up on the shining sun while the wind dried the sweat on their bodies. He wondered if this was the first time he ever shared such a memory with his father. Wondered what Naruto would think of it, as he was no fan of the man. Wondered how he would tell this story. Would he insist, as he had then, that Suzuki's victory was null, that they ought to do it again? They never did, in the end, for one reason or another. They expected to, at some point, unable to consider that they didn't have all the time in the world to do so. Later. The same went with Suzuki and his father. They would talk, eventually. Later they would be open and honest to each other. Later Suzuki would ask his questions, later his father would answer. Suzuki was anxious, suddenly, for later to be now. But the capital came into view just then, and the conversation was closed. They didn't go straight to the palace of the government, as Suzuki thought. Instead, they went to an inn at the outskirts of the central district, where they were to meet a shinobi working as a military advisor for the daimyo. Suzuki didn't know the man, but he recognized him immediately as a member of the Uchiha clan. He sat in front of his father at a secluded table of the inn. Neither gave any indication that Itaki and Suzuki weren't to listen in on the conversation, so they stayed where they were, sitting at the next table to act as a buffer to the other patrons and leaning in none too subtly to hear what was being said. The man, Junji, was mostly here to fill Fugaku in on the current affairs of the palace, the dynamics, the ongoing cases, the opinions, and dissents. Most of what they talked about flew over Suzuki's head. Not Itaka's though, he seemed far more knowledgeable than Suzuki, focused intently on the hushed back and forth between the two men. Suzuki wished he could ask for precisions and explanations, but he feared it would prompt their father to send them away. So he stored the information away and tried to retain the names and places and dates, so that he could ask later. "When can I meet with the daimyo?" his father asked at the end of the report. They only spoke with contempt of the leader of the country, said to be indecisive and weak-willed. Suzuki knew nothing of the matter, yet he was uncomfortable with the way they spoke of the man and his advisors. It was, in fact, a tone he had heard often in his father's mouth, the one conveying that he and his interlocutors considered themselves above and better than the ones they were talking about. He hated that tone. "The son in Jiraiya arrived a few days ago. He said he would wait for you before bringing up the matter of the Akatsuki. It can be as soon as tomorrow." Suzuki ticked at that. There came names he knew at last. But what of the Akatsuki? It wasn't a threat the central government could deal with. Tsunade had made it clear enough that Konoha had to handle it. Very well. Their father turned back to them at last. "I will go to the palace tomorrow. You're free to explore, but don't draw attention on yourself." "Can't we come with you?" Suzuki asked, trying his best not to sound petulant or demanding but struggling to hide his disappointment. Wasn't it the point of this whole trip? No. No explanation would come, nor any room for negotiation. The man was turning away from them already, as his companions ordered sake and food for them both. Infuriated, Suzuki took the food up to their room, knowing the mood would only deteriorate if he stayed. He didn't want to have a fight with his father out there in the open, surrounded by strangers. Though that man, Junji, wasn't a stranger, not completely. He was an Uchiha, he still answered to their clan leader's command. What was his purpose here in the capital? Did he report to the Hokage or to Fugaku only? Did he have orders, plans to carry out, missions to complete? Suzuki had never given much thought to the general politics of the country. Konoha alone was complicated enough. But the daimyo still had a great hold on them and their power. And it seemed that they had their eyes on him in turn. He was there in his angry musing, stabbing his sushi with his chopsticks when Itaka joined him. "Don't be too mad. He wasn't going to take us with him. What's the point of us being here then?" He knew he was being childish. It was good enough to be here already, to even be introduced to all this when it was clearly not their place. But it also was as such because his father made it that way. He was the one who refused to explain anything of the inner and outer goings of the clan and village, who treated Suzuki's curiosity and questions with condescension and impatience, as if Suzuki was stupid for even asking. Itaka sat beside him on the floor and grabbed the extra chopsticks Suzuki had brought up, just in case. Itaka never disappointed Suzuki, not anymore at least. Suzuki didn't ask, yet Itaka always knew, and he always complied. It was reassuring. "Come on, ask away. I'll walk you through it." They talked politics and strategy until their father came to sleep. The capital was very different from Konoha. The roads were paved, the shops were large and spacious, with a lot of choices for everything, most of them superfluous in Suzuki's opinion and yet numerous and expensive. Lots of clothes and shoes, foods from other countries and regions, paintings and trinkets, accessories and exotics, plants and books by the dozen. They found no decent weapon shop, but they stayed in one of the bookshops for a long time. Suzuki didn't have that much money to spend, but he still bought a few his friends might like, one for his mother too, and a couple for himself. Fortunately, He was quite proficient at storing seals, and he put away all their purchase in a scroll once they were done. Itakas too, who had bought even more with no qualm about getting rid of a few clothes to make room in his bag. Sasuke put the scroll away in his weapon pouch, stupidly pleased to do that for his brother. They would sort it back at home. The people were different too. The majority of Konoha's population were shinobi, and even the civilians carried the village's military discipline and organization in the way they dressed and acted. None of that here. People in colorful, fancy clothes strolled around, seemingly without purpose, the streets bustling with activities and sounds. They had jobs Sasuke didn't know, traveling agencies, all sorts of repairs people back home just did themselves or asked from a neighbor, salons to groom hair, skin, nails, pets. They passed by a school just letting out for lunch break. Kids burst out of the door with heavy backpacks full of books and brushes, dressed in pretty, impractical clothes, not a bruise on their bodies. He couldn't decide who was in the right, who had it better. The kids inspired him both disdain and envy in equal measures. They all knew, intellectually speaking, that children outside of the hidden villages received a very different education, that their status in Konoha was special, but he had never given it much thought. He had never given it much thought, but hadn't he wished, once, that they had fewer classes about throwing deadly weapons and fighting each other bloody, and more about history and literature and the world beyond their high walls? But these kids couldn't defend themselves, or anyone. They were weak and helpless. Because they could afford it? Because someone else was supposed to fight for them? The shinobi of Konoha, did they serve these people? He couldn't wait to leave this place. They ate in a pricey restaurant with average stir-fry and decided to check the city's hospital, one of the few places that would be familiar in this strange place. They had fewer medicmen than in Konoha, but more civilian doctors and surgeons. Then again, they treated very different patients. They dealt with chronic disease and disabilities, aging people, and psychological issues. Things that prompted the people affected to simply leave hidden villages. They probably ended up here. He felt the same discrepancy, the same misalignment with the hospital staff as with the children at the school gates. Their lives were so different, and he wasn't sure he understood why. Besides them being born in different places. They went back to the inn and resolved to wait for their father at a table outside, sipping iced tea in the shades and watching silently the people milling around, indifferent. They got a few discreet looks of interest. It was hard to tell which went to who. Sasuke avoided crossing gaze with the girls passing by, unwilling to prompt them into taking a chance. A group of boys in work pants and dirty shirts, probably from a construction site, passed the inn in a ruckus. One of them, shirtless and tanned by the sun, aimed at Sasuke a bright, charming smile that left him entirely flustered. He was pretty sure the boy's friends laughed at him, and his brother might have too. Yet it wasn't that unpleasant. Their mood had lifted a little when they ordered some dango to share, but that was the moment their father chose to reappear, and it was immediately obvious that he was in a rage. The Sunin was there too, not in much higher spirits. They followed them inside, to the same corner. The two men ordered sake as soon as they were down on the wooden seats. Uchiha Fugaku didn't get into fits when he was angry. He didn't scream, didn't shake or pace, he didn't get violent or loud. His voice would just carry more, get heavier like a thick fog, unscapable. His face hardened, his eyes got cold. His anger was focused and overwhelming, it towered over all other feelings, his and others. There was no room for anything else. They could only wait it out. Sasuke had gotten better at going against his father's anger, at knocking on the walls even if it wasn't the smartest thing to do. But his first reaction was still to stay still and silent, to look elsewhere and think of something else because maybe it would recede on its own. It didn't work, yet still he tried. He gave it a few minutes of silent drinking and fuming, hoping that his father would talk on his own, that he would remember his sons were in the room and could be interested in what happened at the palace with the daimyo. As he expected though, when the men started to talk, it was as if Sasuke wasn't there at all. "I will find out about the missions that were handed over," Jiraiya said. "And how they were completed. That won't stop it from happening again. If we know what kind of missions, we will know to accept them, even if we lower the prices. Do you think money is the issue? It's not that we were asking too much. It was the Godame who rejected those missions outright. Sasuke didn't like how his father said go dame. What happened? What did you talk about? He asked, taking advantage of a lull in the conversation. Tsunade has her reasons, Jiraiya said, a careful hint of steel in his otherwise bored voice. Look where it got us. Sasuke didn't like being ignored either. What happened? He asked again, doing his best to keep his temper in check, to remain polite and leveled. Itachi cast him a worried look, maybe tried to convey that Sasuke ought to stay quiet for now, ask later. That wouldn't do. There have always been missions the village wouldn't take on, Jiraiya said pointedly. Where there? Sasuke wondered who that particular reproach was aimed at. Where there? Sasuke had seen Tsunade reject certain requests, indeed. Certain assassinations, certain demands for orders in agitated populations, protection for private fortunes and trips, certain forms of entertainment. And some that weren't paid enough. Was it new? Was it only following his master's wishes? Was it better, that money couldn't buy some of their services, but that they didn't provide any for free either? He wondered at the whole point, at the role of the village, at their power and duties. He thought about Tajuna and the Bridge of Wave Country. Kaiza, its name was, after Inari's stepfather. Their Team 7 might have helped them in the end, but it wasn't why they were sent there, wasn't even what they were supposed to do. All in all, they had gone against orders, they had been in the wrong to get involved. What was the point then? What happened? He asked for the third time, even if he was starting to piece things out on his own. They were talking about the Akatsuki, had to. Tsunade had been livid at the services the village had asked of the organization before her time, and Sakura said Jiraiya had tried to warn the other villages too, to tell them their intentions were far from innocent, that funding them would ultimately work against everyone's interest. She had said he wasn't very successful. Was the daimyo contracting with the Akatsuki directly, now that Konoha refused some of their demands? That the central government had this solution meant they didn't react too strongly to those refusals, but what a solution it was. They were all simply feeding into the Akatsuki's growth of power, with still very little insight into what their end goal was exactly. Besides a worrying interest in the Jinhiriki. Some of which they might have captured and subdued already. Though Sasuke doubted it. Naruto wouldn't let them. If the daimyo can't be reasoned on this. Father. At last, his father seemed to be remiss of Sasuke's presence on the next chair. The realization didn't please him. Not now, Sasuke. Tell us what happened. It doesn't concern you. What are we doing here then? You asked me to come. Why can't you just tell me? That look on his father's face, Sasuke knew it well, it was the disappointed spike of, why can't you understand this on your own, the one that said the question was superfluous and silly. It used to send him rolling in shame, but now it only filled him with rage. Because he hated how his father said the Godame and the daimyo, he hated to think it might have been how he used to say the Sandaime, might have been how he managed to follow that by whatever plans the clan formulated back then. The contempt, the accusations. Always the same undertone. Someone else would do it better. Someone else, and I know who. His mother kept saying that Sasuke didn't know all, couldn't understand. Was he at fault? His father wouldn't tell him. Jiraiya was the one to answer, to break off the confrontation by inserting himself as if nothing was amiss, as if Sasuke wasn't about to leap above the table at any moment. I've been trying to warn the hidden villages and the capitals against the Akatsuki. So far, few have listened. They do their job well, they take on any mission for a low price. And they haven't caused much trouble outside of it. The man shrugged at Sasuke's scalding look. Their attack in Konoha didn't succeed. And the one in Suna is recent. They at least will heed the warning now, but as for the others, as long as they don't suffer any loss. After all, who cared that Uchiha Shisui had almost died? Who cared that it drove Uzumaki Naruto away from his village, that the head monk of the fire temple was killed for his ransom and Sarutobi Asuma might never recover? Who cared for the fate of the Jinhiriki as long as they weren't turned against them? Who in their world cared for others, those stranger to themselves? Someone else would do it better. Someone else. We will go to the palace again tomorrow, and then we will go back to Konoha, his father said, tone final, seemingly of the mind that it would be pointless anyway. He still didn't address Suzuki directly. They left the capital after lunch the next day. The Sunin still had work to do in the city and bid them farewell near the Red District. Suzuki had doubts about the kind of work the man could conduct there, but it was better not to think about it. Sakura's tales about her 2 years under his tutelage had eroded the prestige of the old shinobi in Suzuki's eyes, and he didn't have much to begin with, given how their first encounter had gone, years ago. They had received words of a group of rogue shinobi causing troubles near the border. It was a small detour from their route to Konoha, so their father decided they would take a look, assess the situation. Deal with it if they could, but only then. Suzuki's father wasn't impulsive nor brash, and he wasn't after glory for himself. He couldn't be saddled with all faults. Suzuki was still reeling and Itaka was utterly incapable of managing any sort of conflict, so they traveled in silence for the rest of the day. Only when they had set up camp, when they sat in tense silence around a small fire, when dinner was gone but one of them had to actually say something to send off two to bed and one on guard, only then did Suzuki had to talk, and not in order to take first watch. The Go Dame is right. She aims to set us on another path. There is no wrong in deciding that we could do better. He was determined not to get angry, not to lose his temper. Even if his father looked at him like this, even if he was tense with frustration and impatience. They were stuck here together. He wouldn't let his father escape this time. Gigi, who was curled up on his laps up until then, promptly jumped up and disappeared in the trees, maybe sensing the situation was about to get rather unpleasant. There are consequences to this kind of strategy. Do you think we didn't think this through? We. Suzuki bit his tongue, breathed through his nose. It was presumptuous of him, of course. He was but Tsunade's student and helper, he had had no say in those decisions, his opinions didn't matter. He supported her all the same. He understood what she was doing. Why she encouraged Shisui and Takuma to make the changes they wanted at the academy, why she focused so much resource and time into the hospital, why she tried to encourage their trade and production. Maybe even why she had not gone that hard after Konoha's missing Jinhiriki. He knew it didn't please a lot of the older commanders and clan leaders, he feared their discontentment. He feared it even more knowing that this discontentment could very well take a turn for the worse. As it almost did, once. Things can change, Suzuki said, voice tight, teeth grounding painfully the many things he wanted to say but knew he shouldn't. It was so easy to talk about these things with his friends, when they were lightheaded with too much food and drink and planned all the things they would do when they were older, all the work to be done and the way they would remake the world. He was tongue-tied in front of his father, always feeling foolish and inadequate, clumsy with his words and wild with his emotions. He always lost argument even when he was sure of himself, when he was convinced he was right. You're young, Suzuki. You'll come to realize it's not that easy. Stop saying that, stop it. I didn't say it would be easy, I said it could be done. Am I so dim-witted in your eyes that you think I don't know that? Do you think so little of me? The man was taken aback by the sudden outburst. Suzuki regretted it immediately, but he was on a roll and he needed his father to understand, to get it. Or if he couldn't have that, to lose it too for once. Besides, didn't you think you could change it all once? The atmosphere shifted entirely as Itaki uttered a warning, Suzuki, his voice careful and wary. Suzuki ignored him. Be careful of how you talk to me, Suzuki, his father warned. It was ineffective, Suzuki was no longer a child. Or what? Isn't that your solution? If you're so displeased with how the Go Dame is handling things, why don't you do something about it? He was out of line and the words were bitter to his own tongue, but at least his father was looking at him, was listening and answering, and he wasn't going anywhere. Suzuki didn't care about his anger. Do you think that's what it was about? You don't know anything about what happened then. And whose fault is that? Whose fault is that? I asked, and asked, I begged you to tell me, just to explain, even if I'll disagree, even if I don't understand. I just want to know and you won't tell me, and for what? Because I'm too fragile or too stupid to take it. Because you know you were wrong. Oh, do you want me to tell you then? Father. The anguish in Itaka's voice gave them both a pause. This expression, Sasuke had seen it sometimes, but usually when his brother thought no one could see. A boundless terror with no outward cause and seemingly no cure. Sasuke backtracked immediately. "Leave him out of this," he said weakly, afraid suddenly of what his father would dare to say in his anger, in his need to take over the argument, to put Sasuke in his place. Itachi breathed out a choked-up sigh. "It's not him, Sasuke, it's not just." "Stop." They didn't need to say any more for the three of them to understand. Sasuke cursed at himself because he didn't want them to know. He didn't want them to think that he knew. He didn't, but then again, he did. He had pieced it out over the years, by Itachi's despair and the eyes their mother laid on him sometimes, by Shisui's silence, by Izumi's quiet rage. He didn't need to know for sure, he didn't want to hear it. Whatever it wasn't what he needed to know. He knew it would make things worse, that Itachi couldn't bear it. He didn't need anything from his brother. He didn't want to cause him pain. But now Itachi was staring and he had to think. It wasn't that Sasuke knew. He knew not to ask, not about this. All the rest but not this. "I just want you to talk to me," he said helplessly to his father, distressed at how he could convey in any clearer way such a simple truth. "We don't think alike and we don't agree, but that doesn't mean. I want you to try and consider that I might have a point. That I'm not always wrong, that it matters. And that I could convince you, or you could convince me, if you just give me a chance, if you just." His father surely wouldn't believe that Sasuke wasn't judging him, that he didn't disdain his point of view. But Sasuke could hide it, for the sake of argument, he could listen and try to understand, he wanted to. If his father could just see value in his own opinions, if he could manage, just for a second, to contemplate the validity of Sasuke's stance. This was years in the making, Sasuke. It's not a simple matter. "Father, please. Please, can you see me as more than an ignorant child?" It wasn't the first time Sasuke had said it before, or even today, and yet his father had the gall to look surprised every time, as if he didn't realize, as if he didn't mean to. Which would be worse, that he did, or that he didn't? "Do you want to know why I made that decision at the time? Or do you just want to know if I regret it now?" Sasuke hoped the answer didn't show on his face. It was true that he doubted anything his father would say would be justification enough. He still wanted to hear it. "If only because. If you don't, then try to convince me. It's easy to say now. Because you know how it turned out. But we didn't at the time. We didn't have the benefice of hindsight. Who did you do that for? The clan? Our family? What if you had managed? What if you had overthrown the Sandaime, sat in his place? Where would we be now? What would the other clans have said, how would they have reacted? How much bloodshed, how much conflict? And what would his father have done after? Where did he see the village going? Or was it only the clan that mattered, to hell with the rest? What about you, Sasuke? What will you do if you take on the hat one day?" He was a little thrown by the question. It was almost accusatory, as if his father expected Sasuke to have never thought of it before. Or to have an answer he would disdain. "I want us to be at peace." "Do you think it wasn't peace then? Not a peace between wars. Not one that is still, not one that we wait around until it stops. I will be at work every day. I will protect it all. And of those who will be discontented? Who will disagree? You can't force people into being peaceful. I'll convince them. All of them. I'll convince enough. Not all of us want to wage war, and yet here we are, aren't we? Here we have always been. Did you all want to fight? Is that why it worked? Did it? Did it work? Did you win?" For the first time, besides anger and contempt and annoyance, Sasuke thought he could discern something else in the hard lines of his father's eyes, in the dark on his eyes. Something akin to hurt. "We will try," Sasuke said firmly. He wouldn't be alone. They would try, as hard as they could for as long as it took. His father got up then. He dusted his clothes, tidied up some of his things, before moving toward the tent. He turned back only once. "Try then, Sasuke." Maybe there was taunting in his voice, but that wasn't it, not entirely. Maybe it was the closest approval Sasuke would get from his father. It didn't matter now. He would show him, in time. He would prove to his father that they could do it. He would convince him. He crossed Itaka's gaze, still a little haunted, a little out of here. They stared for a long time. Do you think he was wrong? Sasuke whispered, as much not to be heard as not to spook his brother. Itaka didn't hesitate. Yes. But it wasn't just him. It was. I don't need to know. If you don't want me to, then I don't. Are you sure? Itaka kept staring, unblinking, searching for the truth maybe, for a hint of Sasuke's thought, and Sasuke couldn't bear it anymore. He crawled around the fire pit to fall into his brother, to wrap his arms around him and lay his head on his chest, to squeeze out the ghosts. Itachi held him close, stroking his hair, both of them comforting and being comforted, both needing a moment to come back. Both their parents seemed very far away. The Akatsuki isn't enough of a threat for now, Jiraiya had said. Fugaku had agreed. Despite their attacks on Konoha and Suna, despite their movements across the different countries, despite the worrying level of their power, they had not caused any major disturbance, they had not been threatening to the point of arming against them. To the point of being careful not to cross their path without proper backup and strategy. The encounter didn't seem random, but that wasn't reassuring in the least. The code made them unmistakable, but even without it, Fugaku had seen them both before. Hoshigaki Kisame, and the rogue Sharingan user with his swirling orange mask. Hello, Uchiha Fugaku. We thought we might meet you here. Fugaku stepped in front of his two sons. Chapter 12. Since you know who I am, I would appreciate having the same privilege. The man with the orange mask let out a short, high-pitched laugh, perfectly amused as if this really was a fine joke. Fugaku stored it away, the relaxed stance, the apparent carefree disposition, as if they were just acquaintances meeting by chance on the road. By his sides, Hoshigaki Kisame was grinning manically, his massive sword resting casually on his shoulders whistling an ominous sound as would a hungry predator. I'm Toby. But that's not important right now. I rather think it is, if we're going to fight. Why should we fight? The casual tone was grating on Fugaku's nerves, and he could feel his sons shifting restlessly in his back. They had never faced this kind of situation together, but he was reassured to see they were following his cues and wouldn't do anything rash. Itaka was experienced enough, and despite his stubbornness, Sasuke wasn't impulsive nor reckless. Isn't that why you're here? The man shrugged. Not really. I am here to kill you. We don't have to fight though, do we? Am I supposed to just let you do as you please? Why not? That would be nice. That man wasn't to be trifled with. Everything in his attitude, his voice, and playful words, his relaxed posture, everything was carefully cultivated and perfectly non-genuine, Fugaku was sure of it. There was something chilling in this carelessness when he was so clearly a threat, so certainly here as a mortal enemy. Fugaku's sons tensed up even more at his sides, set on edge too by the affected nonchalance of their opponent. Kisame seemed to be enjoying the display, though he showed signs of impatience too. I'll take the kids, he announced, grinning widely. His eyes were fixated on Itaka. Fugaku battled the urge to get between them. No member of the Akatsuki was to be taken lightly, and they could have more backup on the way, maybe those walking corpses the Godame was so puzzled about, despite her extensive studies of their captive specimen. Fugaku couldn't afford to be emotional now. They would all have to fight. Sasuke. Jiji, Fugaku ordered under his breath. He didn't turn to check if he was heard and understood, trusting that his youngest would know what to do. His cat was hidden in his loose Haori. In the confusion of battle, it would be easy for the trained animal to slip away and fetch them help. But how long until they arrived? The village was at least 4 hours away, give or take the speed of the thing. Fugaku had a rough estimate of the level of Hoshigaki Kisame, high, dangerous. The other one was a complete mystery. Don't go too far, don't get separated. Spare your strength but don't hesitate to go for a kill, if you have an opening. You have trained together enough. Be aware of each other, this fight is for the both of you to win. He had berated them enough for neglecting their combat training, focused that they were on medical ninjutsu. He felt no sense of victory now, to have been right. Only a deep sense of foreboding, a restless tremor at the inevitable confrontation to come, at too many unknown variables and too little assurance of things going their way. He had never felt such a strong urge to simply turn away, to escape. Fugaku was no stranger to fighting, nor fearing for his life and others. Yet he felt unmoored, agitated. Sasuke. Itachi. What about you? Sasuke asked, always the one to protest, always the one to talk back. Fugaku's exasperation didn't get a chance to rise though, before he recognized the emotion in Sasuke's demanding tone. Don't worry about me, he answered. It was absurd that they would be. They were but children, and he was their father and clan leader. Yet the attention, as silly as it was, left him strangely touched. He didn't doubt Sasuke's attachment to him but... maybe he did. There was no time to ponder about any of it. Kisame was done waiting, he charged them with impressive speed, sword dragging behind him. I'll leave it to you, Fugaku said reluctantly, jumping out of the way. As foretold, Kisame paid him no mind, engaging the two teens immediately. Fugaku trusted they would hold their own at least for a while. They had to. He had his own problem to deal with. Are you going to fight me then? Oh, Sage, no. I wouldn't want to go against the famed Uchiha Fugaku myself. Imagine if I get hurt? Somehow Fugaku doubted the man had that much to worry about. And the way he said his name. Fugaku was fairly known in the shinobi world, as were the few most powerful members of his clan, and being recognized or even targeted was nothing new. But this man. Maybe Fugaku was biased by the burning light of his Sharingan, but he was convinced his opponent not only knew of him but knew him, up close. That they might even have met before though he didn't recognize his voice. For some reason this felt personal. Fugaku had no shortage of enemies either. Have you brought another friend then? He asked, fed up with this game when he could hear the clash of weapons in his back, Kisame's pleased laugh. Not a friend of mine, actually. A friend of yours. Out of nowhere he came. 1 second it was only the two of them, the next, a distortion in the air, shimmering with dark sparks, and the next a tall, slender man was standing in front of Fugaku. His ashen complexion and dead eyes left little doubt about his nature, but that wasn't what froze Fugaku on the spot. It wasn't even the fact that this corpse, too, bore the Sharingan, albeit of a strange look with eyes blackened by death temporarily put at bay. It wasn't that this was a reanimated Uchiha. But that it was this one, among them all. That man, Tobi, who was he really? For after more than 15 years, Uchiha Fugaku stood once more in front of his brother. Sasuke had been there before. The first time, in Wave Country, trapped in Haku's ice palace, no way out, no way out. The second time, during the Chunin exam, facing the sun in Orochimaru and the cold press of his murder intents weighing down on him until he couldn't move. He wasn't there against Sasori. There were things he could do then, he felt powerful and in control, he could win. There was no telling he would have, without Lee's help, but the boy had arrived before he could get there. There, where he was now. There, afraid. It wasn't a conscious calculation, that their opponent was too strong, that the difference of level was too great. These things happened all the time, they were difficult to evaluate. Few fights were lost before they began, simply because they didn't know each other enough to be sure of the outcome. Yet there he was. Hoshigaki Kisame kept pressing them on, kept pushing, and Sasuke just didn't know what to do. He wasn't sure the man was properly trying to kill them. This seemed like a game to him, making sure that Itachi and Sasuke couldn't regroup with their father, who was not fighting against the other Akatsuki member but against a corpse, and one that had been an Uchiha nonetheless, dull Sharingan circled with black yet unmistakable. Their father was one of the strongest fighters in the village yet he stayed on the defensive, hesitating like Sasuke didn't think he would ever see him be. And he couldn't go and help and ask what the hell was going on because that fucking shark was having a blast getting in his way. Every time they came a little too close, he would still some chakra. Just a bit, little by little, sword barely grazing and not doing any real damage. The fatigue was real though, Sasuke didn't have all that much chakra to spare to feed that damn sword. Of course, to make matters worse, Kisame of the Mist was a master of water jutsu, and Sasuke didn't have the fire power to go against him. Itachi was faring better by the brute strength and deadly precision of his katon, but it wouldn't be enough. If only they could cross his gaze. Kisame was avoiding their eyes with an expertise that spoke of experience. It wasn't so surprising after all, seeing that his companion, whoever he was, bore the Sharingan too. They must have trained together, must have worked with that specific scenario in mind. Itachi excelled in all forms of ninja arts, but genjutsu remained his greatest strength, by far the best out of the whole clan, even better than their fathers. It was no use if eyes didn't meet. Another problem arose soon enough when Sasuke, preparing to block another swing of the sword, was abruptly pulled back by Itachi's wire wrapping around his waist, jerking him out of the way while his brother went head-to-head with their opponent. "What was that?" Sasuke hissed when they were pushed back once more. "I don't need you to protect me." Itachi didn't answer, he didn't look at him either. He seemed tensed and anxious, jaw set and posture rigid. It was unusual for him to be so put off by a fight. They usually worked well together, but their dynamic was off now. "You were going to get hurt," Itachi stated, as if that wasn't as pointless a comment as possible. "I can take a few hits." "I can't." Sasuke was confused for a moment. Itachi wasn't one to shy away from pain and injury, he tended to have the opposite problem. Their mother had expressed worries over it often enough. It took him a moment to read the despair, the quiet panic in his brother's shining eyes and shaking limbs. Itachi finally looked at him. The enhanced world of the Sharingan meant every little twitch of a muscle was in plain view, every shift of their expression, every raging emotion in their bottomless eyes. Sasuke could get hurt, but Itachi couldn't let it happen. He had inferred that he might be getting in Itachi's way, and he was right, but not in the way he thought at all. It wasn't as if Itachi had never been protective of him before, but Sasuke didn't think it would show up so blatantly in such a high-stake fight. They all had to compose with that fear, they all had to stifle the urges to shield others from harm when harm was inevitable in their lives and getting in the way could make things even worse. They didn't have the luxury of that kind of sentiment. It felt like Itachi was as startled by this turn of events as Sasuke was. He wasn't going to get past it right now, not fast enough to help in their current predicament. Sasuke wanted to shake some sense into him because there was no time, but at the same time he was filled to the brim with the weight and warmth of this feeling, of Itachi's inability to be as detached and pragmatic as he was supposed to be. As they were raised to be, as they had believed him to be right up until this very moment. Not that it was entirely surprising, because Itachi was just different from the rest, in every possible way. Still, that he would be unable, and maybe unwilling, to fight this instinct, that he would express it so bluntly, this felt almost like a transgression in itself. They couldn't dwell on it for too long though. "Leave this one to me, go help father. Or escape, if you can." Sasuke recoiled at the idea, almost protested, but of course it would be the smart thing to do. Jiji was on his way to call for help, hopefully, but Sasuke would be more efficient, and it was just common sense, to disengage if the chance presented itself. Even if he doubted the two men would let him. "Okay. Okay." Itachi stood straight to his full height and turned back to face their opponent with renewed determination, Sasuke put out of his mind for now, which was for the best. "Oh? Are we getting serious?" Kisame said, sharp grin widening around sharper teeth. When the next attack came, it focused solely on Itachi, and Sasuke slipped past, ignored. He followed the sound of fighting back to the clearing they had stopped in, Kisame's wide-range attacks having pushed them some distance away without them noticing. He hesitated at the edge of the clearing, just out of sight. Could he truly be of help to his father? He trusted the man wouldn't be impaired by his presence as Itachi was, but that didn't mean he could use Sasuke in a fight. If he could find an opening. "You're not trying to flee, are you?" The Sharingan didn't grant better reflex, just a better vision, a faster transit of the information. Their reflexes were honed accordingly, and Sasuke's body had moved before he fully understood that the man in the orange mask had popped up right in his face, that he was dangerously close and that Sasuke needed to put some distance between them that very second. It wasn't a shunshin, Sasuke was certain of it. He didn't seem to come from somewhere. The man laughed at Suzuki's surprise and defiance, a grating, unnerving sound that he longed to snatch out of the man's mouth. I doubt I would succeed. True. I don't want to kill more than one today, but it wouldn't take too much to change my mind. Suzuki wished such casualness could be a symptom of foolish arrogance and overconfidence, but he had a deep conviction that it wasn't. Whoever that man was and whatever his skills, he acted this way because he was certain he could afford it, and Suzuki believed it too. He tried to bypass him, just to see what he would do, tried to get closer to his father and his opponent still clashing in the clearing. Once again the man just appeared, solid instead of air, menacing despite his lack of face, or maybe because of it. Sorry, little Suzuki. I can't let you ruin the show. He hated his name in the man's mouth, hated the familiarity, the disrespect. Suzuki had no illusion about his strengths and skills. He was still among the best of his peers, but he wasn't exceptional in combat, the way his father and brother were. Maybe he could have been, but he had made the choice of letting go of that road to take another, to his father's great displeasure. He wondered if the man would take some satisfaction out of it now. He could pull his own weight in a fight, but he was no match for the stranger. The most important thing he had to do right now, was not to let himself be used against his own family. He couldn't let that man get him and hurt him. He had better follow his lead for now. My father wouldn't want me to anyway. That made the man laugh again for some reason. You have no idea how true that is. Come then, come closer. Let's enjoy it, shall we? Unbalanced but unwilling to show him, Suzuki complied, taking a few measured steps forward as the man took a few steps back, until they were out of the cover of the trees, with a clear view on the fight raging. Tsunade had briefed all of them on the reanimated corpses, but they still remained mostly a mystery. She was at least certain that they weren't, in fact, corpses brought back to life. Not the corpses of the people they saw anyway. Rather, it was a form of incarnation technique. A dead soul called into a dead body, manifesting in this vacated envelope with full strength and skills, a proper nightmare. According to her, it only took a sample of the original body to do the trick, and they knew no way of breaking the link for now. The work of the Sunin, Orochimaru. Naruto had left his side at some point, but they didn't know after how long. What did he see there, what did he endure? How did it change him? The Uchiha burned their dead. But there was always a piece they kept. It was repulsive and distressing, to think that the Sunin could have had any access to it, but how else explain the corpse fighting his father then? Because Suzuki knew him. Or rather, he knew of him. He recognized his face, from photographs in albums his mother took out sometimes but his father never looked at it, and of course, from the family shrine. It was Uchiha Asahi. His father's only brother, more than 15 years dead and cremated. In the flesh, or close to it, with the same angular face and serious expression as his father, yet much younger, still somewhat childlike, hair cropped haphazardly at ear length, eyes bigger, cheeks fuller. Suzuki had never realized how young he was when he had died. His father didn't show anything, but it was obvious he was affected by the sight. His attacks were as deadly as ever, as purposeful and powerful, but still Suzuki could track the minute hesitation, the confusion and anger that made him a little unstable, a little predictable too. They didn't exchange a word, yet it was painful to watch all the same. His father had the upper hand and would have won easily enough had his opponent been human. But he wasn't. He kept getting back up, his limbs kept reattaching, his wound closing, his bone resetting. Sometimes they went still, caught in the maze of the Sharingan, but the Sharingan's main weakness was itself. They never fared well against one another. His father caught sight of him, standing at the edge of the clearing. He didn't react to it either, except for the smallest twitch of displeasure on his face. Suzuki almost apologized, but his father couldn't get distracted now. Suzuki didn't try to intervene. The orange mask was watching him closely, he was sure. Whatever he wanted, Suzuki was a part of it, but as a spectator only, at least for now. Uchiha Fugaku, I meant to ask you, since we're all here, the man started, ever so casual. How fair your eyes, I wonder. Fugaku visibly flinched. I mean, you've been using it for how long now? Surely your sight would be in poor condition by now, unless you did what it took to prevent it. His words seemed to egg the corpse on, who was getting more and more vicious, brutal, while Suzuki's father remained reluctant. Suzuki had no idea what the man was talking about, only that it was hitting the nail on the head and affecting his father. What about his sight? What about his eyes? Suzuki tried to pay closer attention to his father's face, though the two ninjas moved fast, too fast for normal eyes to follow. He realized that there was something odd about his father's Sharingan. Do you not know what that is? The man teased. Fugaku, does he not know what it is? How old is he? 14. And you haven't told him yet? I would have thought you'd have force-triggered it already. Suzuki repressed the very childish urge to correct the man on his age. Is that what this is about? Fugaku asked grimly, expression turning darker, angrier. It was a sensitive topic, whatever it was. Maybe. But I'm not the one most interested in the answer, right? Before they could understand what he meant, a new voice rose up in the clearing. Low and gravely, heavy with misuse, like after a long spying mission with little sleep and even less talking. It was a little ridiculous, how long it took Suzuki to identify its source, but then again. He didn't expect the dead man to talk. And to talk in such a bitter, accusing tone. Did you do it? His father faltered enough for his opponent to land the next hit, a kunai to the shoulder that Fugaku only managed to deviate so that it didn't inflict any life-threatening damage. Instead of taking it back, Asahi pressed in, vicious. Did you do it? Did you take them? Did you? Fugaku answered by breathing fire into his face, forcing him to retreat. Suzuki couldn't tell if the corpse felt pain, but he still winced at the melted skin and burnt flesh, though it grew back quickly enough. Fugaku. Did you? Asahi's voice was quieter now, almost pleading. There was no similar softness in Fugaku's answer. Yes. I did. It sounded defiant. He took out the kunai with one brutal movement, and maybe it was such a random moment to choose to move that the orange mask didn't anticipate it, but he didn't stop Suzuki from jumping to his father's side. Suzuki slammed a palm on his shoulder before he started bleeding out all over his haori, muttering about the proper way to deal with such a thing in the heat of battle. He could tell his father wanted to say something, protest maybe. Suzuki was careful to avoid his gaze, easily falling into gestures he knew by heart and could execute quickly and efficiently. He dared to hope his father would at least recognize that. Who is that? The wound was deep but not too damaging. There was no time for any refined treatment, but at least it wouldn't impair his father's movements. So Suzuki focused back on the dead Uchiha, despite how uncomfortable it was just looking at him, so clearly devoid of life yet moving and talking and expressing more raw emotions with his voice and face than most Uchiha men ever did. This is my youngest son, Suzuki. Suzuki, greet your uncle, Asahi. It was surreal, but Suzuki was nothing if not well-mannered. He bowed lightly, though he stayed silent. He had no idea what to say. Meeting the other man's gaze, he realized he too bore a strange iteration of the Sharingan. Instead of the usual tomo, both he and Suzuki's father sported geometrical patterns in their eyes, a lot more black on the red than Suzuki was used to seeing. Of course you had a second child, the man sighed. That angered Fugaku a lot more than all the rest. It had nothing to do with it. Really? You didn't either. Asahi, you must know. Asahi cut the sentence short by suddenly leaping toward his brother. Suzuki jumped back, but he clearly wasn't a target here. The two men exchanged more violent blows without breaks, more and more frantic and aggressive as they went. Suzuki was left stranded on the side and once again taken off guard by the orange mask invading his personal space in the blink of an eye. I wouldn't want you to believe there is a choice to be had here, he commented. And then, louder for both fighters to hear him, Asahi will not stop until you are dead, clan leader. There was the smallest of shift, just a clip at the end of the last word, a slight intake of breath, something that told Suzuki the man had said something he didn't intend to. It was the way he'd said clan leader. There were only two options as to who this person could be. Either he was a powerful foreign nin who had managed to best a member of the Uchiha clan and stole their eyes. Or he was one of them from the start. The second option had seemed too wild until now, because there was no Uchiha deserter recorded in recent history. But the mere fact that they were here, and that the man had specifically brought Fugaku's brother to fight him. And the way he said clan leader. It seemed impossible, yet it was the most likely explanation. It also confirmed that even if he had his memories and feelings, even if he looked alive somehow, Asahi very much wasn't, and he wasn't acting on his own will. He was a puppet, moving upon orders. Tsunade had suspicions of a bond between the caster and the corpse, and ideas about how to sever it, but she had too little to work with, as the link had been broken and erased before the corpses they captured made it to Konoha, effectively protecting the secret of the technique. Snap out of it, Asahi. Aren't you ashamed? His father scolded, in a tone so reminiscent of Itaka sending Sasuke away when he annoyed him. It painted his father in a light Sasuke had never seen before, never even imagined. His father was on these pictures too, but they never felt all that real to him. Do you think I have a choice? Do better, if you want to survive. It was hard to say if Asahi was feeling torn over it or not. It was no use hoping he would indeed break out of this control. Nothing indicated that it was possible, or that he would stop attacking if it was. Sasuke crossed his father's gaze. A subtle nod, 2 directions. Sasuke drew a shunshin and flickered away on the other side of the clearing, escaping the orange mask's watch. His father sent Asahi flying in his direction. Chidori. Sasuke caught him right in the middle of his back. The strength of the corpse's flight almost embedded him on the crackling chakra dancing at Sasuke's hand, who felt his hand sink in the flesh. There was no blood, but nor were there any regeneration, as long as kept his hand there, kept the chakra going. The man trashed around, Sasuke curled on himself against his back to get out of reach of his flailing limbs, knowing his father would unsheath his tanto, knowing that severing the head would at least give them some respite to deal with the orange mask. He swept the man's legs from under him, sending them both to the ground. He knelt on top of his back, his hands all the way through the body, Chidori fizzling out against the rocks under it. He looked up to spot his father. A swinging leg caught him on the upper chest full force. Air deserted his lungs as he was sent flying before a tree painfully stopped him mid-fall. His head slammed against the trees, he felt the skin tear on the bark. I told you to stay out of it, the orange mask hissed, irritated now, towering above him. Sasuke's father was trying his best to bring his blade down on his brother's neck, but having a huge hole in his chest didn't prevent the corpse from grabbing the tanto with both hands and battling it away. He was still in peak form, he managed to push Fugaku back. Sasuke got back to his feet carefully, head throbbing. What do you want? Sasuke asked the man. Tobi, right? Such a stupid name, hating the hint of desperation in his voice. This was unnecessarily cruel and he had no idea what to do about it, how to get them out of this situation. He had an inkling that whatever the answer was, it wouldn't be something Sasuke could give. Or would want to. Despite not seeing his face, he was sure the man was smiling. He reached out and Sasuke had the reflex to block, but worse than attempting to hit him or stab him, that Tobi went to ruffle his hair, familiar and light and making Sasuke's skin crawl. Sudden tears rose up in his eyes as he shivered, repulsed. He was as incapacitated as if he had been pinned to the ground by a blade, his whole body protesting against the touch. For now? I just need one less kaleidoscope in this world. Sasuke slapped the hand away and exhaled as big a cat on as he could on such short notice, just so that the man would get away from him, would stop touching. It worked, albeit in the same weird way it had until now. The man didn't use a shunshin or jumped back. He wasn't inhumanly fast. He literally vanished. Sasuke didn't let it surprise him this time. The how didn't matter. He widened his field of vision, searching. There, a surge of chakra just as the man reappeared as if the chakra itself was spitting him out. Sasuke threw a sling of shuriken in the space that would contain the man a second later. They passed through him. The Sharingan couldn't be deceived. They passed through him as if he wasn't there. But he was, there was weight to his body, he was there for sure. Hey. That's a bit mean, you could have hurt me, the man scolded as he patted the red cloud where a shuriken should have been embedded, spotless and undamaged. Sasuke couldn't figure it out. It had to be some kind of ninjutsu, but how did it work, how to counter it? His father was getting tired, Sasuke could tell. They could be as strong as can be, what use was it if their enemy was impossible to kill? Sasuke still had a seal left to incapacitate it, but the other one wouldn't let them do as they pleased. The clearing was getting bigger with the range of their katon expanding, burning the trees and plants to the ground, leaving only charred trunks and blackened earth. If his father ran out of chakra, he didn't manage to block the next swing of a kunao. Sasuke saw the blade disappear in his side, heard the pained intake of breath as blood very much gushed out of this wound. Sasuke made to reach him, to apply pressure, stop the bleeding. A hand closed around his neck. Not this time, brat. He struggled, fingers dug deeper. Healers are such a pain. Sasuke. His father turned toward him, worried lines deep on his tired face. Even if he couldn't afford that, he shouldn't have, he had to stay focused. Their eyes met, he opened his mouth, he tried to come closer maybe. A blade came out through his throat. A blade, short, single-edged, probably a tanto, probably Fugaku's. It came out through his throat. It was covered in blood. Through the throat, just above the Adam's apple. The blade was horizontal. Single-edged. The sharp side sped through the throat, getting free. No more blade through the throat. You shouldn't remove the blade. It meant bleeding out faster, you shouldn't. Sasuke's eyes were drawn to his father's hands, signing. They could say many things with hand signs. It was useful during missions. But Sasuke didn't understand what he said. Or well, he did. But he didn't understand why he was saying it. He never had before. Why now? There was no use. Sasuke didn't want to hear it. Why? Finally, the orange mask said near his ear. Various instincts were at war in Sasuke's mind. He had to get on with the healing but he could hear his teacher's voice. You have to know if you can help or not. On the field, you have to make this decision. You have to recognize when things are beyond your power. Who was she? He couldn't remember now. What would she say of a blade through the throat? His father fell to his knees, then face first on the ground. Leaving only the corpse standing, bloody blade in hand, face devoid of expression. The corpse, standing. His father, laying down, unmoving. 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 How much blood was that? Something happened then. The blade clattered on the ground. The grip on his throat let up and Sasuke fell too, though he was still moving, though his blood was still inside his body. The world erupted in black flames. I told you to distract this one. The orange mask, angry. What have I been doing, huh? What took so long? You fucked around instead of getting shit done again, didn't you? Hoshigaki same, annoyed. Well, this is unpleasant. Sasuke heard a scream, he saw the flames, burning the trees and the ground and the very air. He wasn't sure. His eyes were burning. Burning, burning, his eyes were on fire. He felt tears stream down his face, but his fingers came back red when he touched it. His eyes were shrinking and expanding, they were trying to escape his eye's socket and to drill back into his skulls, they were growing too big for his head, they were compressing down on themselves. He heard a scream. Maybe it was his. What the hell, this one too? I didn't expect both of them to manifest. Wasn't that a bit of an oversight, Toby? They might prove useful later. Black flames grabbed at a cloak with red clouds. Abandoned on the spot. It was consumed in a moment. We need to leave immediately. Sasuke didn't care about them. The fire was spreading, devouring everything on its path, and he had to get to his father. He couldn't see, or maybe he could, but the world was black and red and extremely bright and his eyes burned all the way to his brain, so he just crawled forward. His head hurt. He didn't see him as much as he became aware of him in the field of his perceptions, another light, the only one, there should have been two but... Itachi! Itachi! He was kneeling not far from their father, gripping his head, his hair, tearing it out, whining in pain. The flames were getting closer. They would hurt if they touch, Sasuke was sure of it. They would consume them both. Itachi! His eyes calmed a little, the spinning of the Sharingan slowed down until it settled into something else. He reached his brother, his father, the blade. Itachi. The flames were his brothers, somehow. Somehow Sasuke just knew. As he knew that nothing would put them out, no water, no earth, no jutsu, nothing. Nothing except Itachi himself. A black flame jumped on their father's leg, started to eat. There was no reaction, no scream, no move, even though it had to hurt badly. His father could handle pain, but this had to be unbearable. He couldn't let his father get hurt. Itachi. Sasuke tried to shake him, tried to get him to look at him, but his brother resisted, whining like a wounded animal, blood flowing from between his fingers pressed to his eyes. Sasuke focused on the flames. Through the haze of red of his vision, because the black fire was Itachi's but in some way it was his too, he could get it to obey, he was sure, he could appease it. Nothing would put it out, no water, no earth, no jutsu, nothing. Nothing but Itachi's will. Or his own. He put the fire out. With excruciating focus splitting his head in two, he willed the black flames down, so that they wouldn't be hurt some more. He hadn't realized what a roar it made. Silence fell back on the destroyed clearing. They were alone. Just the two of them. Alone. Itachi stilled. He sat up straighter, he looked at Sasuke. His eyes were changed too. They stared at each other. The world was different from what it had been just a few minutes ago. The colors and the sharpness and the depth. The world was different. Their father was gone. Sasuke. Sasuke lost consciousness. Itachi cleaned up his face. He didn't know why it felt important, but it did. He wiped away the blood with a cloth from his weapon pouch. He didn't know where he had put his bag. He did the same with Sasuke's face after the panic had receded, after confirming that he was just exhausted and nothing else. Itachi was exhausted too, but Sasuke was out and their father was. He had to stay awake. He wiped both their face carefully, and then he unrolled a body scroll on his father. He couldn't carry them both. He signed the seal, his father vanished inside the scroll. The kanji of his name inked their way up onto the white paper. To be returned home. He had let go of the Sharingan, though it wasn't easy. This new one was much more invasive, clinging to his eyes, refusing to leave. Even now his vision was still blurry, his eyes still throbbing. He knew what it was. Had seen it in Shisui. His father had explained, but only shortly, as if he didn't want him to know. Shisui had earned it after his first mission as a Jounin. He had come back with his teammate on his back and blood running down his eyes. Itachi gently settled Sasuke on his own back. No blood. That was important. He didn't exactly know where to go. The sun was setting. How many hours had they stopped here? They should have been far away by now, much closer to home. They didn't have their bags anymore. Was that bad? Their mother wouldn't be happy. Their mother wouldn't be happy. He needed to head east, vaguely, so he left the sun in his back and started walking. He didn't expect a single step to take so much effort. Sasuke was heavy on his back. He was on the brink of chakra exhaustion, having run the Sharingan for too long on top of the blooming of the Mangekyo. He had managed to trap that Kisame, in the end, but the man had a strong, steady mind, and maintaining the hold had proven challenging. He might have been able to do away with him, in the end, to break his mind inside his head if he hadn't felt, in the middle of the genjutsu, the sharp flare of Sasuke's panic, a second before he lost awareness of his father's presence, and he had dropped it all to rush to them, only to see his father fell to the ground and things were a blur after that. His whole body hurt, he had lost enough blood for it to be worrying and he knew he had done a patchy job at healing the cuts and bruises collected in his fight against the Kirin. Sasuke would have scolded him, but Sasuke was unconscious and Itachi was worried about the state of his body and mind. He had to get them home. It was his job. Yet Sasuke had to shake him because he was lost, had to put out the flame because Itachi couldn't, burning what was left of his energy in the process. Itachi was the oldest yet Sasuke kept proving steadier, more reliable, and more resilient. Itachi had to get them home. It was on him now. Their mother was waiting, he had to bring Sasuke home, he had to keep him safe. It was his job, it was all he was supposed to do. Take another step, put one foot in front of the other. Head east, go home. Go home, go home, go home. By the time he noticed people approaching him on the road, they were almost on him already. He was deaf and blind and he couldn't feel his body at all. A strangled sob tore out of his throat. He couldn't fight anymore. He didn't want to. He was so afraid, on the brink of collapse, but he didn't know if he would just crumble on the floor and not get up, or unleash that new power swirling in his eyes, let it go and be unable to call it back. Sasuke had stopped it. Sasuke was better than he was. Itachi had to protect him at all costs. He stopped in the middle of the path, no strength left to just hide behind a tree or at least get out of the way. The light was fading rapidly but he could make them out running to him. He called upon the Sharingan one more time, just in case he could recognize. He just needed the flash of a headband to sag in relief, all his muscles unclenching at once. He barely avoided falling down. He had to hold Sasuke up. He had never been so happy to see Konoha's symbol on a cold metal plate. There were a few of them. He spotted Izumi, he spotted Marco too. That was good. Izumi was his friend, and Marco was a good medic nin. He would help Sasuke. Strangely enough, he saw her last, despite her being the one leading the group. In fact, he only recognized her face when she was close enough to reach out to him. That's when he remembered why it was important that there were not so much bloody tears on his face. She would be worried enough as it was. And this way she could touch him, could lay a hand on his cheek and wipe out his clear, regular tears. Mom. It's okay. I'm here, it's okay. She hugged him to her chest, and smoothly shifted to unhook Sasuke from his back. He resisted a little, still taken with the imperative to look after his brother before all else, but she soothed him with soft words as she took Sasuke's weight from him. She lowered them both to the floor and tugged at Itachi to follow. He knelt at her side. He was so lost. She let Marco take a look at Sasuke, although she kept him close to her, resting in her arms, her other hand back on Itachi's face, stroking lightly. Itachi was waiting. He didn't know what for until it happened. She turned to him, and she asked, although she was already sad, although she was already mourning. Itachi, darling. Where is your father? He felt like the hand on his cheek was the only thing saving him from shattering down into tiny shards of glass, from dissolving into his own mind. He pressed into it as he reached into his weapon pouch and took out the scroll. He was afraid she would take her hand back to grab it and he would fall down and never land, but she didn't. She reached around Sasuke's shoulder with her other hand. She didn't look at the scroll, she didn't take her eyes off him. Thank you. You did good, my son. She put the scroll in her own pouch. She didn't look at it and for a second Itachi wanted her to, because she had to. As if she needed to look to be sure, as if she didn't know. She took a seal instead. One used to put people to sleep. They usually slammed them full force on their target's forehead or neck, but she laid it on him as gently as if she was tucking him in. You can rest now. The darkness was a blessing. Mikoto had played the morbid game in her head the entire way. In the best case scenario, the three of them were alive and well. Worst case, the three of them were dead. And in between. That was where the game was. Which would be worse? One dead, which one? How would she rank the situations where it was two? All three badly injured, or two healthy, but one dead? Jiji could only relay that they were facing at least two members of the Akatsuki, that they didn't look like they intended for a friendly chat. They were hours away. Mikoto had plenty of time to think. She had not made up her mind, when she saw Itachi. Nor when she spotted Sasuke on his back, and had to contain herself and stay calm as she checked, discreetly, if he was still breathing. He was. Her husband was nowhere to be found and she could have told herself that he might have been too injured to be moved, or that he had been taken hostage. She knew though. Itachi wouldn't have had this expression on his face, he wouldn't have been standing there like this, alone and lost, if Fugaku was anything other than dead. Mikoto hugged both her unconscious sons to her and she cried, for their loss, for their pain, for the pain to come. And for the relief to have both of them breathing in her arms. For the shame, of feeling happy despite her grief, because they had been returned to her, her precious children. She supposed Fugaku wouldn't be mad at her for it. Not that she would ever know. She would know nothing of him, anymore. His thoughts and actions, what he would have done and said, his place in their future, they would forever remain a mystery now. He should have been wrapped around her, he should have been shouldering their son's weight with her. He wouldn't, anymore. Mikoto cried in her son's hair. Chapter 13. Uchiha Fuyugaka was killed by the Akatsuki. Kankuro had taken the habit of springing such news on Temari unprompted, just bursting into her study and rambling bad news exclusively, almost making a contest out of it. He was trying to keep her on her toes, or maybe he just assumed it would be easier to swallow this way. He wasn't wrong, she didn't need coddling. A trait shared by most of her fellow shinobi, in truth. The Suna people had a reputation for being quite harsh and rude, but she only saw it as being efficient and straightforward, no wasted time in pointless pleasantries. Kankuro took it to the next level because he knew she would let him get away with it. She was all for less stilted formality, but she drew a hard line at disrespect. A line many in the administration had no trouble crossing. They would learn eventually. If she achieved her goal. The head of the clan, right? Suzuki's father. Yes. It seems like they were ambushed. Had she wanted to deal a blow to the Leaf Village, she too would have targeted the man, one of their strongest and most well-known fighters. It wasn't so easy to strike him down though. She sighed at the item that had just appeared at the ever-shifting bottom of her to-do list. We'll send some condolences. And maybe take the opportunity to get in contact with the Godame again. We need to confer on the matter. It's getting out of hand. He made no comment in the lines of, "It's not a matter to you yet." She wasn't yet the Kazekage of Suna. She couldn't think about failing though. She refused to let the seat go to anyone else. She would fight half the village for it if she had to, she didn't care if they disapproved, if they were angry, if she was hated and scorned. There was work to be done, and she would do it. If they wanted someone else after she was done, she would step down gladly. For now, she would fight for it. "How are the preparations going?" she asked, since her mood was already ruined. "We're looking at 20 contestants for now. Already 5 more than the previous day." The process of choosing the next Kazekage was another thing she longed to dig her hands into, but she would have to go through it first, pointless and harmful traditions included. It could have been a smooth transition, as per their way, the most legitimate successor came out of the previous Kazekage's family. If most agreed with their claim, then they were just appointed without much more formalities. But if they didn't, anyone could challenge the claim and decide they were a better option. They fought it out, because battle strength was still the base of their power. But since the old geezers up for the seat weren't always in such a great shape, or simply above such squabbles, they could appoint anyone as their representative in the fight. It was also a show of influence and political power, to be able to secure their best fighters as a champion. There were many who didn't want to see her take on her father's title. They had their reasons, many of them. She was too young, she was too brash, she was a woman. She was her father's daughter, in a bad way. She was Gaara's sister. They didn't like her, found her too much or not enough, lacking in many areas, unbecoming, unworthy. They had some good points. She didn't care about any of them. She would just have to fight them all down. 20 or 40 or 100, she didn't care. She could have chosen champions of her own, as the main claim, as many as she wanted. It could even save them the trouble of the whole affair. If she had enough support to fight all of the counter-claims and more, they could decide to withdraw, accept her victory. As if she would rather save herself the humiliation of finding out exactly how many would turn her down, how few would agree. Even Kankuro had not offered to stand for her. It was possible he didn't approve of her, but at least she hoped he wouldn't outward oppose her. Should it come to it, she would fight him too. She found this confrontational mindset incredibly freeing. She had always been the pacifier, trying not to rock the boat, to smooth things out between all the forces at play in their council, administration, and village. Never going against anyone. Never going against her father. She had decided upon a new strategy. Steamrolling. Her predecessor was an inspiration, her father had done what he wanted, in the end, not listening to anyone, and he had gotten what he wished for. For a while, at least. She could keep it up for a few years. Enough to deal with the Akatsuki, to throw the bases of different relationships with the other villages, to turn some of their politics toward new horizons. To convince enough people, so that it wouldn't crumble after her. She almost looked forward to the work to be done. To feel like she was finally doing something. Will we get more? Maybe up to 30. Still not much of an issue, he said confidently. She was flattered by his faith in her capabilities, but it depended on which 30. Suna did have warriors of note still. But there was no choice anyway. She would win. She had to. The election drew a lot of people, as it was wont to do. Some to see Temari fail, some to see her win. No way to know. The arena was crowded, though strangely calm, almost solemn. It was unnerving, but she was so far past the point of anxiety she had somewhat circled back to complete apathy. Temari of Suna is stating her claim as the Godame Kaze Cage of Suna, the assessor announced from his venture point at one end of the arena. Those who contest this claim and those who support it, please come forward. Past 30 to fight. Most she knew, and most weren't a surprise. At least she wouldn't be up against people she thought of as friends, or at least as allies. Up until Kankuro came down into the arena as well. Armed for battle, with his puppets and his makeup, ready for a fight. For a terrible moment she was sure he was walking to the opposite side, that he was officially opposing her, that he would try to take her down. She exhaled a shaky breath when he came to stand by her side. Told you it wouldn't be that much more. We'll make quick work of it. What? She didn't have the time to ask him what he was doing, or just to thank him, or maybe to cry on him a little. It was Beiki next who came down, and who inexplicably joined her as well. Casual and confident, as if this was on par, as if she wasn't having the strongest freak out right then. What are you doing? He threw her a puzzled look, like the question was pointless, the answer, obvious. What do you think? I don't, she blurted out. She felt her face redden in embarrassment. She was overwhelmed. They kept coming. Some she knew, to some extent, young Matsuri, that Temari had pardoned and set free against the council's decision, Amagi, one of Kankuro's favorite students. Amino, the medicnin, the one who had tried her hardest to save her father's life. Korobi, Isago. Some she couldn't even name. Guards from the palace, Chunin fresh from the latest exams, older shinobi too. She didn't understand. I don't understand. Kankuro raised an eyebrow at her, looking pretty confused as well. They stared dumbly at each other for a moment, before his expression changed entirely. He sputtered and cursed, indignant, furious even. Did you? Are you stupid? Did you think? Did you expect you'd be fighting it on your own? She had a feeling he wouldn't like her saying that. Yes, that was absolutely what she thought would happen, and no alternative had crossed her mind, certainly not this one. The one where her side outnumbered the other one. She had refused to think about it too hard. There was no one she could think of who would come to her aid. She wasn't cut for the hat, she had been told often enough. She didn't know what she was doing, she was struggling already, she was just selfishly clinging to it because she couldn't bear not to, because she had to try her hardest, try with all her might, for the village and her family, for their future. She didn't expect anyone to follow her. She didn't want to hope for it and be let down, she didn't want to ask. She didn't see why they would. She wouldn't even follow herself. Yet here they all were. Kankuro was about to blow up at her, given his reddening face and the tension building in his body. But before he could explode, and before she could crumble, Beiki set a heavy hand one shoulder each, looking as stern and impassive as ever, yet somewhat indulgent too. Perhaps even a little fond, though that might just be wishful thinking. Kankuro, calm down. And Temari. He stared at her, making sure she was listening, that she wouldn't shy away from his words. She couldn't disobey him, and she couldn't ignore any of his words. Whatever he said. Temari. Your father is dead. She scoffed. Didn't she know that? Wasn't it the reason why she had to stand there, why they all did? Her father was dead. Her father and his iron fist on most of the village's affairs, his hold on the council, on their forces. On her. Her father and his constant disappointment, his expectations she kept failing to meet. Gone his influence, gone his judgment. Gone the fear of his wrath. It's your turn now. Her father, who had many supporters, but who many disagreed with as well. Her father she barely had learned to confront. But she still had, hadn't she? Loud enough, hard enough. The claims are set. Do the challengers wish to hold up to their counterclaim? They started to talk among themselves, gauging, assessing. It would need only one. They could all stay, but if it was only one. I withdraw. Joski, from the council. No spine, no conviction. The first one to follow the movement and the first one to jump ship. For once, Tamari was almost glad to hear his plaintive voice. For others were soon to follow. The more they withdrew, the more the position was untenable for the ones remaining. The fights would be recorded, their name, remembered. Those who had only meant to take advantage of a majority, who knew their claim too weak to be supported, they had no interest in staying. They dropped it, one after the other. In the end it was only those who truly wished to take the hat in her place, who could no more bear to see her have it as she could cede it to anyone else. 6 of them. Kankuro stepped in front of her. You stay here and watch, don't you dare try to fight. None of them has any worth to go against you. She slapped the back of his head with a scoff, unwilling to leave him to make his cool claims without earning some teasing in return. It was either that or hugging him with all her strength, and she would rather leave this to a more private moment. For now, she took a step back and let others fight her claim for her. It was an extraordinary feeling. This place is getting rather crowded, Yujito commented. Her serious tone was alleviated by the slight smile on her face, as she watched their friends go about their way in the courtyard, so Naruto figured she didn't mean anything bad by it. She was right, they didn't exactly have a room each anymore, some split between study, resting place, and meditation chamber, some shared. Rashi had offered to build them a larger table, as his contribution. Naruto was very pleased, that meant he planned to stay, at least for now. He was skilled with his hands and the large axe and hammer he was wielding, indulging Fu curious fluttering around his labor. It will be hard to house everybody, when it's all 9 of us, he replied. You are confident they will come? It was a statement, not a question, but there was still wonderment in her tone. She knew of his conviction. He knew of her doubts. Ah, maybe you're right, she added. They might not have much of a choice. It would be their fault. They were upsetting the balance and thus making it harder for the remaining Jinhiriki. Rashi wasn't affected because he had been wandering already, untied to his village. Naruto wasn't sure how that worked. But there could be another way. All in all, their latest venture and brush with the Akatsuki could have gone much worse, and they were well aware they had gotten away so lightly through no prowess of their own. The villages might come around. She leveled him with a scrutinizing look that he had a hard time holding. She could read too much in his casual words. Just because they helped us this time does not make them our allies, she reminded him, worried, maybe, that he would forget. That he would start to grow misplaced hopes. There was this saying. Enemies of our enemies, but between the Akatsuki and the Jinhiriki, there was no saying which the village would pick as friends against the others. He couldn't help hoping. She was less optimistic. She had no faith in Kumo, at any rate, and seemed to believe Killer Bee would be the last to want to join them, to want it at all. It was unspoken but they still knew, the distinction between them. Gaara and Naruto were the same, deep down, they kept alive the hope that they could go home someday, they had people they wished to see again. Fu wasn't so sure, but she too missed her home in some way. Yujito didn't. Neither did Rashi, seeing how long he had been away from his village. They didn't see a future where they would be welcome there again, where they would even want to be. Was it because they were older? They wouldn't be able to live in this temple forever. It was a certitude both comforting and frightening. What would become of them, of their bond? When would they even be able to move on, to be free? They were safe here. This only was hard to dismiss. Where else? They were interrupted by Karen shooting up to her feet, from where she had been reading under a tree. Someone's coming. The good mood evaporated as tension ranked up, fear tinged with fury at anyone daring to reach them here where no one was supposed to be able to. Karen turned to the woods beyond the temple's ground, expanding her senses, searching for the intruder. She was interrupted before she could report anything by Roshi's booming voice. "It's all right. It's just Han." "Who?" Naruto asked, on edge. "My friend Han. I told him to come." "How?" "We have our ways." Naruto bit back a nasty retort. "How, why, who?" He couldn't just invite people here. This place could not be discovered, they needed it, they had nowhere else to go. They were still just as tense when a man appeared beyond the tree line. He was of impressive build, taller and broader than most of the people Naruto had ever met. Half of his face was hidden by a mask, and his forehead, by a headband from IWA. With his red armor and large kasa further hiding his face, he was pretty intimidating. Yet Naruto understood immediately that they had nothing to fear from him. Damn fish head. It was the Jinchuriki of the Five Tails. "You didn't warn them that I was coming, nor asked for permission. Your manners remain terrible, my friend." The man's voice was deep and powerful, rumbling clearly through the courtyard. Roshi laughed, unaffected. "I apologize for my sudden appearance," the man added with a small bow. "I didn't mean to startle you. I'm Han." Yujito was the first to recover. "Hello. We didn't expect it indeed, but it's a good thing. You are welcome here." "He is?" Karen asked loudly, full of suspicion. Yujito nodded. The other girl sighed. "Oh, another one, right? Great." Despite her foul mood, she was careful not to say more, just as Roshi had not introduced Han in such a way. "Not the Five Tails or Iwa's Jinchuriki. My friend Han." That was a nice thought. The temple was definitely too small now, but Naruto couldn't bring himself to care, and he was sure the others didn't either. Han didn't say how long he would stay or why he had come. He simply came to stand at Roshi's side. The height difference was rather comical, and made it obvious he would remain there. It didn't help that Suigetsu and Gaara came back soon after from their own trip. They were supposed to seek out the Jinchuriki of Kiri and to check on Yugo and Kimimaro in the northern hideout. Neither mission had yielded great results. "Kiri's Jin was pretty insufferable," Suigetsu said lightly. For him to have such an opinion though, the man ought to have been especially unpleasant. Gaara didn't refute it either. "He won't come." Said he didn't see the point. He was even more of a killjoy than Karen. That earned him a knife flying straight toward his head, that he avoided with the ease of a long-lived habit. The knife embedded itself in the wood frame of the temple's door, adding to a large collection of similar nicks and cuts. Karen cursed from the kitchen. He also complained that we were making his life harder, that surveillance was tighter on him after all these desertions. "We gave him your seal," Suigetsu told Naruto, "but I'm not sure he didn't throw it away right after." Naruto held up a disappointed sigh. "What about the other?" "We couldn't get any intel. As far as everyone is concerned, Kiri only has custody of the one cosmic monster." Naruto turned to Gaara. "Sanbai isn't there?" "He is." Suigetsu rolled his eyes, mumbling something along the lines of, "Can't get him to say one word and they ignored him. I couldn't tell for sure. It was quite distant. I wasn't sure we would be able to reach them." The Sanbai was the last of the tailed beast they had yet to identify and meet. They had no idea who it was sealed into and where they might find it. It had supposedly been sealed in the last Mizu cage, but no one knew what had become of it after the man's death. It had been assumed the Biju might have disappeared with him, but if Gaara was able to feel it, it had most likely been transferred beforehand. "The one you met, he didn't know?" Yujito asked. Yotakata. And no, he had no idea, and didn't care much. It made Naruto anxious just to hear it. Couldn't he feel the compulsion, to follow his fellow host, to come to them? Maybe Naruto was weaker to it than others. "What about Kimimaro and Yugo?" Karen asked, joining them in the main room now that she was done with most of the preparation for lunch. She was on duty with Niji, who wasn't all that helpful, if one didn't count the endless entertainment she got out of teasing his rich boy ways. Suigetsu got uncharacteristically somber. "Bonehead isn't doing so well." Orochimaru had sent him away to the northern hideout with Yugo, officially so that they would watch over it, but the underlying message was clear: by dismissing him from his side, he was also cutting off the bulk of his heavy treatment. Yugo would take care of him, but there was only so much he could do. They don't want to come here. It's... Suijutsu showed a rare moment of hesitation. Gaara picked up the thread. Kimimaro would not be able to make it through, as he is now. Karen bit her lips, chewing off curses. She had wanted to go, despite never being able to do much for her friend by way of a cure. Her medical knowledge wasn't advanced enough. It would take someone like Orochimaru. Or Konoha's Tsunade. No one ignored who were the best at medical jutsu these days, but knowing meant nothing if they couldn't hope to approach them. From what they had heard, Sasuke was one of Tsunade's most promising students. Was it a possibility in their future, that Naruto could simply ask him, that his friend would be willing, and able, to help? He wanted so badly to see it happen, yet it felt such an impossible feat. Not anytime soon enough to help anyway. A forlorn silence fell onto the group, frustrated by a problem which solutions were out of reach, useless. Karen was the one to cut it short with her usual brand of cold pragmatism. Whatever. Let's eat. Her apparent indifference didn't fool anyone, but she was right, whatever. They needed to eat. Roshi was training rather intensely with Fu and Gaara. It was rare to see Gaara caught up in such a way. Fu always tried to coax him into it, since his abilities were the hardest to deal with in close combat, but he rather shied away from fighting, when he could. Maybe it was the novelty of it, or, more likely, it was the fact that sand didn't go well against freaking lava. Gaara had a well-buried but lively competitive streak that wouldn't be put to rest once unearthed, and this was a challenge he wasn't about to back down from. Fu was delighted. Roshi seemed to be having a good time too. They were having fun, and Naruto didn't tire of watching. Han watched them from the side, pulling smoke from a long pipe that exhaled a fragrant, floral smell. He occasionally threw light teasing jabs at his friend, who answered playful comebacks without breaking streak against his two opponents. Naruto was very curious about them. They were older, and they had led very different lives from the rest of them. Their village had more or less let go of them, and they had managed on their own all those years. Naruto was eager to ask them how. There was another thing he was even more eager to do, but he was met with an abrupt refusal that cut his excitement short and lodged an uncomfortable weight on his chest. Absolutely not, was what Roshi said. Not even to Naruto. Yujito was the one to invite him and Han to mediate together with the rest of the Jinchuriki. It was a way to reinforce all bonds, between themselves, between the Biju, and between humans and beasts. They were not all at the same level of closeness and trust with their respective inhabitant, but they all found solace and peace in the exercise. Roshi refused to even hear a thing about it and stormed out of the temple before they could try to convince him. The rejection stung with an unexpected sharpness. "Please forgive him," Han said gently as they stared after the man. "You won't break the topic easily with him. Their relationship is rather fraught." Well, Naruto also had a rather fraught relationship with the mystical chakra being attached to his soul, but he still tried to do something about it. "Leave him be," Yujito warned even before Naruto could take one step in the direction of the exit, to chase the man down and change his mind. He reined in his frustration, willing to prove to her that he could be more patient than he was. At least she seemed a little pleased. "What about you, Han?" she asked, moving on without much more care. "Are you joining us?" "I would be happy to, although I'm not sure what this entails." "We'll show you. Come." They used the main room of the temple, the largest. They would do it outside when the weather allowed it, but it was getting colder by the day and the sky was especially dark now, menacing. They didn't need to touch for it to work, yet Naruto found it easier if he sat close to Gaara and leaned on his back. Fu often took one of their hands. Naruto had always hated meditation, an opinion shared by the other girl. Maybe that was why it was harder for them to get there. Though this was different from just sitting around doing nothing like they forced them to do sometimes at the academy. They sat together, they closed their eyes. They reached down, past the barriers of their own mind, all the way down to the cell. They crossed the bars. Releasing the seals or even untightening them was out of the question, but they had learned to open the other side of the cages. The one that led not to their physical world, but to the place where the Biju were held, where they came from maybe. It extended endlessly beyond the cages. And it inevitably led them all to each other. Naruto caught a glimpse of the Gobi joining the rest of the tailed beasts and gave them a wide berth. Talking to the Biju was mostly weird and unsettling, and it wasn't like they had much to say to each other. They held various degrees of resentment and distaste to humans in general and the ones they were chained to in particular, but the core remained the same. Even if they no longer threatened to overtake their host at the first occasion, even if they allowed this strange breach of their prison, were it at all possible, they would be gone from this place, free from their restraints. Naruto wanted to ask how they even came to be here, what happened and how, where they had come from and how they had been enslaved. None of them was very loquacious though, and it felt a little mean, to ask so bluntly. Naruto didn't even know the Kyuubi's name yet. And you won't. Shikaka was liberal with it, and Komei was fond of her ward. For the rest, the names remained a mystery. It was frustrating, and Naruto suspected that more than a need to guard it, the fox now sought exclusively to annoy Naruto with the knowledge. Such a little thing, but it made the boundary clear, they might work well enough as reluctant allies, but there was no trust here, nothing to build upon. What, you don't have enough friends? Shut up. Han's relationship with the Five Tails seemed rather pacified. What 30-something years together would do, maybe. Though it had done nothing for Roshi and his own passenger. They could feel their presence at the edge of their consciousness, close but out of reach. Naruto felt for the Biju. He felt for all of them, beasts and humans alike. Karen berated him often for it. You can't save everyone, she kept saying. They don't all deserve it. He failed to agree. They did this for a few hours, as a kind of treat for the lonely Biju, but also because it helped stabilize the foreign chakra into their system and use it more seamlessly. So it's for your benefit most of all. Naruto tried to resist shutting down the fox, out of sympathy, but he made it hard to keep it up. I'm not a thing, the fox had said once. What are you then? Whatever. Naruto had decided for a he, if only because it would be awkward to have a female monster down his mind. The fox's mocking was loud and clear, but he didn't protest the choice. Fu roped him into a spar once they were done. 2 tails each, so as not to cause too much damage and draw attention. Yujito had put a veto on them bursting out more tails unless they were under a barrier, and Karen had to be in exceptional dispositions to go along with that. 2 tails it was then, more than enough to have some fun. They went at each other with a savagery that made the others cringe at times, but there was something liberating in letting go of the limitations they had learned from much less resistant teachers and peers. So what if they stabbed and cut through each other, stole massive amounts of chakra, broke bones and burnt skin? It would all be gone in a few hours, it didn't cripple them as it would regular people. Fu, more than all of them, embraced this part of her with great delight. They were different from the rest. Always had been, and the world had never been shy reminding them of that fact, so why be shy in turn? They were interrupted by Roshi's booming laugh. You look like you're having fun, kids. Mind if I join? Fu agreed with great enthusiasm, eager for more lava dodging. Naruto never turned from more training. Yet he found himself unwilling to go on. I'm beat. I'll leave you to it. He made a hasty escape before Fu could point out that, from her experience, Naruto was never such a thing as beat. No Jinhuriki was obligated to join their group, and certainly not to partake in their practice, if they didn't want to. They were all free to do as they pleased, that was the whole point. So he had no right to express this anger. If Roshi didn't want to participate in this part of their training, it was his choice. He had his reasons. Naruto had no place to say anything. He was angry anyway. Wasn't the point to be safer, to be stronger, to get better control, to be better at all? Using the influence and power of the tailed beasts was always a risk, they were always in danger of losing their grip, of getting overwhelmed, of letting their feelings rule over their senses and feeding the Biju with it until they could overtake their better judgment. Naruto still lived in fear of the few times he had felt his reign over his own body and mind slip away from his grasp, overcome with rage, terror, pain. They couldn't afford to be careless. He stalked through the woods, unwilling to go back to the temple and talk to anyone. Maybe Gaara, but he had been gone for several days and would be with Neji now. Naruto didn't want to interrupt. They wouldn't say anything but he would feel bad anyway. Infuriated, he plopped down in the middle of a clearing and started picking flowers at random, with too much force to do anything with them afterward. He hated managing to rationalize his feelings away and staying chained by them anyway. He didn't want to feel angry, he knew he shouldn't even be, so why couldn't he get rid of it? He was unfamiliar with Han's presence, and thus got a sense of it when it was already too late to get away. The tall man stepped into the clearing, albeit with slow, careful steps. "Sorry to disturb you. Do you want me to leave?" Naruto didn't want to be rude. He didn't answer, hoping his sullen face would be enough of a clue. Either it wasn't, or Han didn't care, because he settled down anyway. He moved rather fluidly for a man of such stature. He had shed most of his red armor, which made him look less intimidating. His face remained covered though. "Don't let it get to you. Roshi has nothing against you. But it will take him some time to open up to such a thing." Was Naruto so transparent that even this near stranger could see right through him? And if he had, Roshi would have too. Would he be mad, vexed? He felt a little bad for blowing you off, but he wouldn't say a thing himself. He can be rather stubborn. "It's fine," Naruto felt obligated to say. He didn't want to burden anyone with his own hopes. "How old are you?" Naruto looked up from his flower pile, surprised. "Huh. 15. You're young." Naruto couldn't determine if it was a reproach. "You're friends too. It's impressive that you made it here, that you managed this much." "How?" Naruto moved the ground a bit, biting his tongue, wondering if further questioning would be ill-received. Han was the one to seek him out, right? To start asking. He couldn't be mad at being asked back. "How old were you when you left?" "Older. Both Roshi and I were over 20. How did you? I mean why?" Han let out a short laugh, though it didn't sound mocking. "One day we just realized that if we were to leave, there would simply be nothing the village could do about it. And so we did. And we were right. Didn't they send people after you?" "They did. But they didn't have that much to spare, and we had made it clear we wouldn't be too cooperative." Naruto pondered at the idea. Would he have been able to kill Konoha Nin, if they had managed to find him? It might have depended on who came. Or did it? He had killed before. Was there a difference? We struck some kind of deal. To not join forces with another village, to come back and protect IWA if they were in dire need. To remain discreet. We didn't do too bad at that, it mostly stayed a rumor only, that we had deserted. They left us alone. And what did you do?" Han smiled under his mask. "Maybe. Not much. Compared to you. Get away just to live their lives, just like that." It seemed extraordinary and mundane at the same time. Any choice was monumental when it came to the fate of the Jinchuriki. "Did you ever meet others?" "Some. Only by chance though." "What about?" "Never from Konoha, no." Naruto swallowed a hard lump of disappointment. "Who was it?" "The one that came before you." "I'm not sure but I believed the previous host was my mother." Karen and he had looked into the history of the Uzumaki clan. The library was one of the few things Orochimaru was good for, and the free reign they had over it. The history records mentioned the first host of the Kyuubi, from their own clan, chosen for their exceptional chakra reserved and skills with sealing. Very few of them had moved out of their home in Uzushio, and thus the clan was mostly extinguished by Kiri's attack. It felt so distant, despite it happening less than 30 years ago. But things were quickly buried and if no one was there to remember them. Naruto wasn't even sure ever hearing about Uzushio at school, though he wasn't the most reliable source when it came to the academy's teaching. They had mentioned going, one day, to see if they could salvage something of their heritage, a pilgrimage of sorts, despite them never even hearing about Uzushio from anywhere other than dusty old history records in a dark, shady library. They would go anyway. Eventually. Uzumaki Kushina, he was pretty sure was his mother. And Orochimaru had mentioned the previous host of the Kyuubi being a young woman. And there were his father's words, though he tried not to think too much about that. Ah. A much unfortunate fate, Han commented, sympathetic. Hosts didn't survive the extraction of the tailed beasts. Or was she already dying, and they had performed the transfer in a hurry, lest the Biju be let loose, and worse, lost for the village forces? They sealed it inside me the day I was born. I never got to meet her. I never knew my mother either. Or my father. In IWA, the hosts were picked among the village's orphans. Less trouble with the families this way. His tone remained casual. A terrible thing he had long since made peace with, for lack of a better option. Some of his rage, Naruto wished he was able to let go of too. But it didn't want to let go of him. In Suna and Kumo, they were selected among the Kage's family, to ensure loyalty, in both ways. In Konoha. Ah, they did the same, didn't they? Though it didn't work out so well for them, for him. Do you think we're wrong? Naruto asked in a rush. To do what we're doing? Do you think Am I in the wrong? They would all still be home, was it not for him? Caged, alone, but home, safe. Safer than they were out here, hunted, cornered, having to take stupid risks just to get food and information. He felt like he had forced their hands. Even the ones that didn't join them had a harder time because of his actions. In a way it was reassuring, that others had had the same urge he did, to leave it behind, to fend for themselves. But Roshi and Han had been sort of smart about it. They were older. They knew what they were doing. I am in awe of your courage and strength. To be honest, it makes me feel a little guilty. Maybe we should have done this sooner. But I admit I never felt too strongly about the others sharing our plague. For a long time we didn't even know there were more, or what we were exactly. You don't think it's foolish? It is foolish all right. But no more than staying put and waiting for things to change on their own. Still, they could have gone differently about this. Try to unseal the beasts, at all cost, or simply manage to pass them safely away to someone else. Wash their hands of the matter. But who would Naruto be, the fox gone? What feelings would he still be able to cling to? How could he bear plaguing someone else with his burden? He wasn't even sure what he was trying to achieve. He wasn't sure who he was. If it's not you, it will be someone else, Han said. I've been wondering lately, what will happen to the Gobi after me? If the village will try and retrieve it before I meet my end, who will be unfortunate enough to inherit it? Even this Akatsuki, I have to wonder what they would do with us. Roshi said there was no point joining forces, but I know the idea made its way in his head. There have been many before us. As it stands now, there will be many to come too. The cycle was endless, wasn't it? Even if they died without passing down their seal, the tailed beasts wouldn't stay gone for long. They would be sealed again, people would be sacrificed to their prison, again. Until someone did something about it, decided that no, they wouldn't. Naruto couldn't turn away from that. No matter how hopeless, no matter the risks. No matter his burning desire to drop it all and go home, to see his friends again. This couldn't go on. If he could do something to change it, then he would. He would do everything he could. And if others wanted to follow, he would protect everyone too. I am glad to be among you now, Han added as a final point to the conversation, answering questions Naruto wouldn't dare say aloud. Don't be so hard on yourself. Easier said than done. They made their way back to the temple after a moment longer of peaceful rest in the forest. Han had picked some flowers too, but Naruto had only realized his purpose when the man had dumped a thin, delicate row of intertwined flowers on his head. He'd laughed heartily at Naruto's flustered reaction. Who knew such a large man could weave such fine work? You can't help yourself, can you? Roshi asked playfully upon their return, pointing at the flower crown. Han shrugged, unaffected. Are you jealous? You know I'm always happy to make you one. Roshi grumbled a no thanks before going back to the kitchen. His first day and he was roped into the rotation already, Yujito was nothing if not efficient. Han went to give them a hand. Naruto. Gaara grabbed his sleeve, shifted closer. He stared at Naruto, unblinking. Ah, yeah. Gaara slid his other hand into Naruto's, squeezed pointedly. Neji was scowling in his back. You know he gets antsy when you're not in his line of sight. Don't go brooding on your own. Naruto flushed lightly, mortified, again, to be so known by the people around him. Mortified and shamefully pleased. He squeezed Gaara's hand back. Sorry. I didn't mean to trouble you. This accounted for why he had not approached his friend earlier too. Gaara leaned forward, Naruto followed suit, so that their forehead could rest against each other. He was immediately appeased. Don't, Gaara whispered, determined. Naruto nodded weakly. No need to say more. Gaara knew him best of all. They got into setting up the table, the mood light and playful with the perspective of a shared meal and some peace at home. Did Gaara tell you? Suijutsu said to the room as he juggled with the plates he was supposed to arrange. We heard from Suna. They appointed their new Kazekage. Yujito smiled at the boy. Your sister. Gaara nodded, obviously pleased though little of it showed on his face. There was no telling how well it would bode for them, but at any rate he could be happy for her achievement. There was even hope that she would be more lenient than her predecessor. That was the impression Naruto had of her anyway. And one last thing, Naruto. Suijutsu. The boy raised an unimpressed eyebrow at Karen's threatening tone. What? He has a right to know. No he doesn't. Suijutsu grimaced, displeased. I don't know if anyone has told you before, but you can be a real bitch sometimes. Tell me what? Naruto cut in before this devolved into a full-blown fight that would delay Diner and the information he was yet to get. We heard something else on the way here. Tobi and Kisame, they ambushed some Konohinin in the Land of Fire. They managed to ace off Uchiha Fugaku. Karen cursed. Him, or them, or the entire world maybe. Naruto didn't hear her, or anything that was said after. His mind was already far away. Sasuke. Chapter 14. A loud noise woke him up, something falling on the ground followed by the soft curse of whoever had let it slip from their fingers. Sasuke was home. In his bed, in his room, the smell of the sheets and the spots on the ceiling familiar and comforting. It was always better than to wake up at the hospital. The hospital? Ah, yeah. His whole body ached, muscles knotted, and stiff from overwork. The exhaustion despite the long hours of sleep, familiar too, chakra depletion. He was thirsty, his head hurt. The classic aftermath of a rough mission. He needed a moment longer though. His mind knew even if he couldn't remember yet, no simmering panic, so he had not lost consciousness while worrying over the well-being of one teammate or another. But it wasn't a team, wasn't it? It was. It came back all at once. Despite the memory crashing down on him with the force of an angry wave on a stormy day, he remained motionless and still, lying there on his bed, barely able to breathe, let alone move. The waves kept pouring in, the fight, the blade, the flames. His brother. His father. His father. He stayed still until the tide receded and he could inhale again without drowning. The ceiling wasn't that familiar anymore, nor the room, the sounds from outside, the smell, the light. It was absurd, none of it could speak of this new truth, none of it could tell about his father. And yet, the world was different. Sasuke's father had died. He listened to the house, to the footsteps in hushed conversations, the hum of the washing machine, a cat walking on the roof's edge. There were more people than usual, there were many things to discuss after all. The noise that had woken him up had to be the laundry basket slipping from his aunt's hands, or a stack of books knocked over by someone unused to it standing in the way when Sasuke knew to avoid it in his sleep. Or maybe it was something of import that belonged to his father, and now had to be moved for inspection. Or safekeeping away from his mother's eyes. Sasuke didn't want to get up at all. He had to though. He did, carefully, because he hurt all over, but he didn't have any extensive injuries. The cuts had been closed, the bruises soothed with ointment and rest. How long had he slept? Probably 100 years, at least. He opened his bedroom door as silently as possible. He couldn't have given a reason as to why. He needed to be inconspicuous, he needed not to be heard nor seen. He wouldn't know what to say if he ran into someone else. He was up, but he wasn't sure why, or what he was supposed to do. He figured a trip to the kitchen would be a good start. His stomach was up too, and he was starving. Somehow, he was completely baffled to find that there was someone there already. He had heard the noises. He knew his family was home. Yet to stumble upon his mother at the table, with Tekka and old Tiaki, to catch a glimpse of Uchiha Tomoyo in the living room with Shisui and Itachi, left him shell-shocked and breathless. The tears swelled up immediately, as implacable as the rising of the tide, and he couldn't spill them like this in front of all these people. He was going to dissolve and melt away. He was sure his eyes would leak out and take away his face with it, his body and his mind, and that he would disappear into his tears, never to be anything else. He spun around and ran back to his room. He could only inhale again once the door was closed in his back, once he was safely hidden away. No one would come in here, no one would see him, and he would see no one. Already the haunted face of his mother was carving itself in his mind, her pale skin and scrambled expression, her swollen eyes and bitter mouth. He couldn't let her see him cry, on top of it all. He couldn't bear receiving her comfort when she was hurting so much already. Sasuke cried in his room alone. He let the sea pour out of his eyes, so much and for so long that it would surely fill the whole room soon, but he couldn't stop. His father was dead, and it hurt. It hurt because they weren't done. Sasuke had so much to say to him still, so much to ask, so much to prove. And it would never happen. His father wouldn't be here anymore, to any of it. Not to see Sasuke succeed at all he had set out to do, not to see him prove that he was right. The better place he had hoped their relationship would reach with time had become unattainable. It would forever remain as it was, stilted, shot still in time. No matter what happened now, no matter what he did, how hard he worked and how much he wished for it, his father would have no part in their future. In any of it, his place would remain empty, his role unfulfilled. Just like that, his spot vacated, his presence gone. There was a knock on the door. A soft, "Sasuke." His brother's voice. Sasuke panicked again, heart rate picking up. He couldn't handle it. Sasuke? No. What was he answering to? He was scared Itachi would try to enter, although he had never, not without being invited in first. He was the only one scrupulous about it, their parents far less careful with Sasuke's prickliness over his privacy and the invasion of his room. All right. All right. I brought you some food. I'll leave it at the door. Sasuke almost told him not to go, to come in. He wanted to look at his brother, to make sure he was okay, and he didn't want to hurt him more or to worry him, which he was by sending him away like this. He was paralyzed with indecision, ruled over by contradicting needs. He wanted to see his brother, but being seen by him, or anyone, was unbearable right now. Sasuke snuck a hand outside to grab the food. He was starving, even if eating didn't appeal to him at all, and fell back asleep as soon as he was done. He figured he would be safe wandering out of his room in the middle of the night. The house was quiet, surely the others were asleep and the rest had left. He needed a good wash. He felt gross, sweaty, and snotty, and with the disturbing sensation of blood clinging to his skin still, even if there was none to be seen. He had woken up crying again, his face was dry and puffy. A bath would make him feel better. Maybe. He ran into his mother in the middle of the corridor. He didn't hear her before they collided, both making use of their training in order not to make any sound as they moved around the sleeping house. The panic came back full force. He wasn't ready to face her. He turned away, trying to hide his face, ready to run back to his room, but... Sasuke, wait. She didn't need more to keep him right where he was. There was a note of pleading in her voice, but mostly he was just used to obeying her every word. He still kept his back to her. Should I be ashamed for crying? She asked. Sasuke spun around in a second, too offended to remember why he didn't want to. No. He realized too late she had played him, as usual. Then why are you? He felt his face redden, embarrassed, and tried his best to wipe the remaining traces of tears from his face. She was smiling softly, indulgent, but her face was pale and messy too. It hurt to see her like this. I don't want to make you sadder, he said weakly, knowing it was a poor sentiment. He couldn't imagine it mattered all that much, in the depth of her grief, but he still wanted to try. He had to do something. "I feel better with you in my sight," she said. He could have guessed that too. It was also part of the problem. He didn't know if he could hold this role, didn't know if he could be of any comfort. "I just need to see you," she added, probably knowing exactly what he was thinking. "It's not on you to comfort me, Sasuke. Who's going to then?" She was surprised by the question and didn't have an answer. After a moment, it made her laugh a little. Sasuke felt unreasonably pleased by it. "I'm sorry. I love you, Sasuke." It wasn't fair. It wasn't fair that she would do that, it wasn't fair that she would say it now when she had said it before, when it had never been an issue. Not with her. His mother was generous with her affection and praise, even if she would still seem cold, he imagined, by regular standards. They didn't often hug or touch, it just wasn't their way, but she would smile and brush his hair out of his face and congratulate him on a job well done, and it was never hard for her. She had said it before. Not that often, but often enough. He recognized the shape. He knew what it looked like. His father was already silent when Sasuke had crawled to his body, but Sasuke didn't need to hear his last words to have understood them, and he wished he had heard. It was the last time he would say it. And the first too. Sasuke started to cry again. In silence, with no sobs and barely any movement, he cried as he saw his father's lips move and imagined how his voice would have sounded like, and he cried because it was his father's last words, it was the thing he had wanted to say last. In the split second he had realized that he wasn't going to get another chance to say it, or anything else. It was too much to bear, too much to deal with. His father would never follow up on this. Sasuke would never know if he would have been able to say it otherwise, if it was coming in their future. That particular future, it was gone. Out of all the ones remaining, this road was close for sure. It was impossible now, out of reach. His mother rested a hand in his hair, stroked gently as he sobbed. Sasuke couldn't tell her, but she might have known. She knew her husband well, and her sons too. She was the one to know best, out of all of them. Kara played the Tsuzumi at the funerals. Sasuke had not asked her, and he only realized when he saw her dressed in her ceremonials, by the altar in front of the temple, that he wanted her to. He was grateful she had taken the initiative. There were other musicians, mostly older men, closer to his father. But Shisui was among the choir, as were a few of Mikoto's closest friends. The funerals were for the deceased and their loved ones alike. Itachi and Sasuke lit the pyre, a soft continuous cat on either side of their father's still corpse, after their mother had laid a white cloth on his empty eyes. Sasuke could only think about the very first time his father had trained him in the fire jutsu, on the pier by the lake. He was a terrible teacher, taciturn and impatient. Sasuke had largely learned and trained on his own, in the hope of gaining approval and respect from the hard-to-please man. He wanted to believe he had managed some, in the end, but it hurt terribly that he would never know for sure, that he would never get another chance, would never get to just ask. His father's body burnt, and they bid him farewell. The whole clan was present, not all could fit in the temple's courtyard, despite its size. They spilled in the street, it wasn't like it would block any traffic, as the whole district was in mourning, and would be for a few more days. And then life would resume, he supposed. It had to. It felt impossible now, but fathers had died before, right? And their sons had mourned and cried, and then they had moved on. Tsunade was there too. Strangely enough, it felt that she was here as his mentor, more than the Hokage of the village. That she was sending Fugaku away as Sasuke's father, more than the head of the Uchiha clan. Maybe it was absurd to think this way, but she had made no demand nor suggestion to speak, to say a few words, to pay her respect in any way different from all the others. It would have been ill-received and she might have known. Or she was just honest. Other clan leaders came, sometimes with their families. It was hard to know which came as friends, as allies, as figureheads, or just as a sense of obligations. Hinata bowed deeply to Sasuke and his family, and she held his gaze for a long time, unblinking and full to the brim with the same sadness that still clung to her and refused to leave her be. Her own father was nowhere to be seen, still in seclusion. Suzuki felt deeply connected to her, both through the people they were missing, through the weight of their family's heritage, and through their inability to ever reach out and seek comfort over their pain, always so formal, so stilted. Starved for affection and fearful of it all the same. But the Uchiha were faring better around their complicated history, these days, than the Hyuga were. There were still voices rising against her, loud enough to be bothersome. He wished he could comfort her. He was as unable to give it as she would be to receive it, so they simply stared, and they understood each other only a little. Their other friends stayed away, as he had asked them to. He needed to stay steady during the long night of the funerals, and he wouldn't be able to if they showed him comfort, if they were here for him. Later, away from prying eyes, they could do it a different way, in the warmth of their home, with food and drinks, with forced laughs and over-the-top antics, to try and banish the sorrow, to push the light in. As they had when one of Koji's cousins was killed on a spying mission, as they had while Shino's mother fought for her life after a deadly brush with a new foreign poison. Although it might be harder this time, Suzuki would be needed at home. After all, the clan had just lost their leader. They wouldn't waste time talking succession, he knew. It would have been Itachi, had things been different, but it wouldn't now, and he wouldn't accept it anyway. Not Suzuki either, he was too young, too out of sync with the clan's thinking, and he had no will to. The next leader didn't have to be a son of the former, but it had just been this way in the past. It couldn't anymore, so the question remained open. Suzuki pondered as he stared at the fire, his skin dried up by the heat and his eyes watering, yet unblinking as he went through the names and faces, as he tried to imagine this new future that had no existence in his mind just a few days ago. There was no doubt that it had been in discussion before. His father could have died at any time. But there was no reason to truly bother with it. They were never foreseeing enough, despite their best efforts. They had simply believed the time would come to wonder, as if any of their leaders had ever died a peaceful, predictable death. It would be put to the vote if discussions couldn't bring about an agreement, but building a strong majority wasn't going to be easy. Everyone could vote, from the age of 15 or if they were already a genin. Suzuki had no idea what he would do. He felt pretty awful to have his thoughts taken up with such base, soulless things, but what was he supposed to focus on? His father's last, bloodied words on silent lips. His mother sleepless wake for the past 4 days? Itachi's haunted look as he wandered aimlessly from room to room, surprised every time not to find what, or who, he was looking for? He was better off listing all the potential candidates and their support, doing complicated calculations to try and predict the outcome of their leader's death. It was easier to think about it this way. The clan head and his father were two different people. Suzuki had dealt more with the former, yet he would miss the latter more. Strange, how that was. Itachi thought they would come sooner. He thought, as soon as Suzuki was awake, as soon as they could move, they would be called at the Hokage Tower, but most importantly, they would be brought to the Uchiha Temple. Yet they waited for Suzuki to be ready to step out of his room, and they even waited for after the funerals and the fast. Every day Itachi had to remind himself that not everyone was the same, that things had changed. Danzo was almost 10 years in disgrace and 4 years dead, and still he hovered, still he kept his hold on Itachi's mind. Somehow Itachi was still there, in these dark quarters underground, being fed the most terrible thoughts by the most soothing voice, being stirred gently, softly, to unredeemable extremes. At times it felt he would always be trapped down there, on the edge of some unspeakable tragedies that his mind couldn't quite conjure up but feared all the same. His mother kept saying that it didn't matter. That he had done nothing in the end, and so he could forget, could forgive himself. But she didn't know. It was through no will of his own that they had avoided that fate. She didn't know of his resolve, she didn't know his mind. His father knew better. He wasn't so forgiving. They had tried, as best they could, but the deed was done and his father could never get past it. Not that he should have. But all the others had, and now his father was dead and Itachi felt like he was getting away too easy. Who would watch him now? Who would remember what he was capable of, that he couldn't be trusted? "Are you okay?" Shisui asked, stopping in his tracks. "We can do this another time. They'll understand." He stared at Itachi, gaze heavy, piercing. He could read him so easily, Itaka felt embarrassed sometimes just standing next to him. Felt so transparent, so hollow. They didn't talk much about things that truly mattered, but that didn't mean Shisui wouldn't have things to say about them. He had to get fed up sometimes, of Itaka's gloom, of his constant doubts. No. It's fine. Sasuke would be there already anyway, and he would testify alone if he had to. Itaka wanted him to be able to rely on his older brother. He wanted to stand steady enough. I'm here if you need anything. Izumi too. You know that, right? We're here for you. They knew, both of them. Itaka didn't know to what extent, in what sordid details, but they knew some, knew enough. They weren't as soft-hearted as Sasuke or their mother. Izumi especially, she wouldn't tolerate any straying, any misstep. Would she be strong enough to stop him now though? The Hokage's office was crowded, with clan leaders, senior jounin, most high ranks of the Uchiha clan. Sasuke stood by the Godame's side, as he often did. He did his best to look stoic and mature, surrounded by adults who wouldn't think too much of him. A familiar heat of fondness and affection warmed up Itaka's core as he watched his young brother fighting for his place, for his voice to be heard. There was nothing the boy couldn't achieve. Itaka went to his mother. Sasuke would be the one they wanted to talk to. The one who had engaged with the mysterious orange mask. The one who had seen Uchiha Fugaku die. He recalled it all with a steady voice, trying to give details over techniques and strategies. Itaka knew he left some things out though. Some things the man had said, some words exchanged. Do you think they were targeting Fugaku specifically? Narashukaku asked, one of the main voices of the interrogation, rather void of emotion. Yes. Why? They brought his brother, just to fight him. And they said they wouldn't let him get out of it alive. I mean, why do you think they wanted him dead? Sasuke paused. He hesitated on what to say, how much to reveal. His eyes flickered, just a second, to their mother. Seeking approval, counsel. The man implied he wanted to take a powerful force out of the board. But it seemed personal. I don't know for sure, it's in the way he talked, some things he said. I believe he knew my father. Not just knew of him but knew him. And he was full of hatred. Strategically speaking, it wasn't smart to get so offensive when the Akatsuki has not been directly confrontational so far, outside of their quest for the tailed beast and their move against Suna. So I think this was personal, more than strategic. How cold he sounded, Itaka's little brother. Even when he said my father, he was as emotionless and factual as any good shinobi should be. It could have been frightening if Itaka didn't know his brother so well. Others might think him unfeeling, but there was nothing further from the truth. Whatever the reason, the Akatsuki has now moved directly against us, the Godame went on, subtly shielding Sasuke from more scrutiny. This is no more a matter we can ignore, and adding to what happened in Suna, it should be enough to prompt the other villages into acting against them, or at least recognize them as a threat. There is a chance the organization will get more offensive. We will hold off most low-stake missions outside the village for now, and see if there have been similar incidents involving other nations. They nodded in agreement, and she dismissed them. The rest would come later, except Uchiha. They stood to attention, all of them with their black hair and pale skin, unmistakable. We are sorry for your loss. We will await the nomination of the new head of your clan. There was something of a challenge in their voice. The Uchiha present only nodded before following the rest out. Sasuke wanted to stay behind, but Shisui told him to come. Tekka was waiting for them outside the tower. Their mother lingered too, a slight frown on her face, even if she pretended not to listen. There are more things we need to discuss. Itake, Sasuke. Shisui asked to be the one to induce you, and it has been granted. You have to go with him now, this can't be delayed. Is this about? Sasuke started, but he didn't know how to finish. He rubbed at the underside of his eyes, as he had been doing incessantly for the past few days. Shisui will show you. Got to the temple. Mikoto, you can't go with them. I know. I have my own affairs to tend to. The exchange was fraught with tension that had Itaka's skin crawl. He couldn't imagine the transition going peacefully. Surely some would be displeased, there would be infighting, backstabbing, it couldn't end well. His mother was on edge already, they all were. Itaka couldn't stand it. "Let's go," Shisui said firmly, stirring them back toward the district. He meant to keep Itaka away from all this, with reasons. Had it been possible, Itaka would have been outside the village by now, far from it all. Instead, they had to go to the temple. To the secret passage under the altar, to the vaults of the clan where they kept their history and secrets. Words inked in paper and carved in stones that only the Sharinon could decipher, or even better. Both of your Sharinon evolved into another form. We keep a record of its users, it's not so common. You'll get new abilities unique to your eyes, we'll have to train these together. And I'll give you a rundown of its usual capabilities and limitations. Sasuke's frown was deepening by the minute, while Itaka couldn't bring himself to act surprised. It was only the three of them here, in the dark rooms where the clan convened in secret, where they hid their darkest deeds. The main Jikyo Sharinon was to be kept a secret, but Shisui had never hidden anything from Itaka. Especially not this, when he had come back from a mission disoriented and exhausted, short one teammate killed brutally by shinobi from the mist during a routine reconnaissance mission. He had told him about the record, about the conditions and warnings. Itaka had hoped he would be spared the evolution, but alas. Here they were now, Sasuke too. It happened before? To others. Sasuke asked, hands on his face still, probing, as if he could feel the heat of this new power under his skin. Itaka understood the urge, it was an itch he longed to scratch. Maybe it would go away if he gauged his eyes out. Yes. It happened to me. That's why I was allowed to bring you here. Shisui blinked. Black brightened into blood red, into an unfamiliar pinwheel shape. It twirled for a second before he willed it away, mindful of its heavy chakra consumption. And other unwelcome side effects. Why did it manifest now? How does it appear? Shisui grimaced. He must have hoped Sasuke wouldn't ask. Mainly like the regular Sharinon does, under high emotions. It has to be strong though. Usually it's witnessing the death of someone close to you. Itaka kept his eyes straight ahead, so as not to cross Shisui's gaze, so as not to give anything away. Shisui had brought him here before. They had read the scrolls, dug up the history. Many of them had sought to forcibly awaken the main Jikyo before. They had manufactured the tragedy themselves. Itaka never dared question his father about it. He was too afraid of the answer. It's called the main Jikyo Sharinon. But we give names to each of its abilities. You've experienced some, haven't you? He was addressing Sasuke, mainly, for Itaka had already laid it all to his friend. The black flames, inextinguishable and able to burn through everything, endlessly. Itaka would have laid waste to the entire forest, had Sasuke not been there to stop him. Their eyes were linked in some way. It was one ability they shared. It seems hard to control. And it's exhausting. You have to use it carefully. Besides, it deteriorates your eyesight very quickly. You could go blind in just a few years if you're not careful. So don't go and use it without thinking, alright. Shisui's tone was light but he got no lightness in turn. Sasuke's face had hardened, soured in distaste at what he had just heard. Really? And there is no way to fight that? No. Itaka flinched. Shisui had marked a pause, barely there, but enough for him to catch on to. And for Sasuke too. Shisui noticed, but he didn't correct the lie, and Sasuke didn't call him out on it. What did he know, how? He had never heard of the main Jikyo before, and yet. They wrote down their name in the register, they pressed their bloody fingertips next to it. Shisui's name was just a few lines above, and their father's a few more. There had to be less than 10 of them alive now. They would need to be put to use. It wasn't a power they could afford to spare, if the conflict intensified with the Akatsuki, if the Biju got involved too. Shisui had been targeted for this very power. In a way, Fugaku had been too. And Itaka and Sasuke would be next, most likely. Depending on what power they manifested, they wouldn't have much of a choice. The first one, they called it Amaterasu. Heaven's light seemed darkly appropriate for the black fire that could burn to ashes anything it touched. They quickly found out that Itaka was far better at lighting it up, and Sasuke, at extinguishing it. That wasn't going to help the Itaka problem, Shisui thought. He had been deeply shaken by their confrontation with the Akatsuki and the death of Fugaku. Anyone would of course, but Itaka was more fragile than most. The resulting tension among the clan only made it worse. He blamed himself for being unable to save their father, and for forcing Sasuke to be the one to rein in on both their grief, which Itaka had been unable to do at the time. It wasn't unheard of for siblings to share similar abilities in their iteration of the kaleidoscope, but of course it had to be the detonator to Itaka, and the soothing to Sasuke. It might not even be a true disposition, more like the immediate consequences of their fight, but Itaka would see the signs if he wanted to. Mikoto had asked Shisui to keep an eye on him. She couldn't be everywhere, especially if she was planning what he thought she was. They would know soon enough. Sasuke looked gloom as well, rendered restless and anxious by the ambient tension, lost as to what he was supposed to do next. He wanted to be involved, despite his age and lack of proper power. He didn't want to be cast aside this time. He kept asking questions about the Mangekyo Sharingan. Who had acquired it, when, how? Shisui had to give him a rundown of his own abilities, though he flat out refused to give a demonstration. You can compel anyone to do anything. Pretty much, yeah. Is that why? He thought better about finishing that, yet it had to be Naruto on his mind. Is that why they gave him to you? Sasuke was no stranger to the power of the Sharingan on his friend and his demon, Kota Amatsukami, or not. And yet he was right. He asked about the damage it could do. Shisui had not lied about it, not exactly. There was no way to curb it, for him. After all, he was an only child. Let's end it here for today, Shisui said when it seemed like Sasuke was going to activate his Mangekyo yet again. We'll pick up again later. The boy didn't protest, though he looked like he wanted to. He stifled his words after a quick glance at his brother. Sasuke didn't understand Itaka very well, but he was attuned enough to his moods and emotions. Itaka didn't appreciate that much. Sasuke didn't follow them back home, busy with one thing or another. He avoided the house. Mikoto had said to let him be for now. When Shisui and Itaka got back, they crossed paths with a few of Mikoto's friends, leaving a gathering for tea that had spilled well into the evening. The woman was washing up plates and cups when they made it to the kitchen. There were a few notes and reports scattered around that she gathered hastily to make room at the table. She didn't look like she had been crying, or mourning. She was lively and determined, and Shisui was pretty sure he knew why. If she wasn't talking though, he wouldn't either. They exchanged a long look over Itaka's head. Where is Sasuke? With his friends, I believe. He said not to count on him for dinner. You stay then, Shisui. Fetch that Hyuga of yours if you'd like. Let us eat all together. It's getting cold. It was ironic, for he doubted Fugaku had ever brought much warmth to the house. But the loss was the same to her, whether he had been loving or not quite so. They would fare without him now. All right. Thank you. She smiled faintly, a little sad. He never managed to be any less formal with her, despite her numerous attempts at a warmer, less stilted relationship between them. He would always remain a bit of an outsider, stranger to her warmth. The deeds of the parents weren't so easily shaken off by their children. Itaka. Her commanding voice called him to attention. There was a quality to her tone that made it hard to disobey her, as knew the numerous kids she had trained up. Itaka and Sasuke were especially susceptible to it. Shisui too, if he was honest. Sasuke is going to need you. As I am. Do you understand? They stared at each other, unblinking. Itaka would have many protests to this, about how he was unreliable, how he wasn't strong enough to shoulder any of it. But Mikoto's orders suffered no contradiction. Maybe that was what he needed. He would do what she asked of him, one way or another. I understand, mother. They would fare without Fugaku, but they would fare together. How fare your eyes? The man had asked. He had been taunting, for sure, but Asahi reacted strongly to it. Did you do it? And his father's answer. Yes. I did. Shisui's lie, that there was nothing to do about the corrosion of the Mangekyo. You've been using it for how many years now? Did you take them? Of course you had a second child. No eyes ever wasted, in the Uchiha clan. Sasuke needed to check, to go back to the vaults where the answers would be. It was chaos now, meetings after meetings where the clan couldn't reach an agreement, and he had to take the chance while they were too preoccupied to watch him. Sasuke? Are you even listening to me? Sakura asked, a touch annoyed. It bloomed to full annoyed when he answered honestly, no. She was filling him in on their run with the men responsible for Asuma's state. The mission was a resounding success, yet she was frustrated. Naruto had slipped between her grasp easily, busy with his own goals and allies. Sasuke didn't know which they ought to find worse, Naruto treating them as enemies, or Naruto ignoring them entirely. He didn't want to think about it for now. Do you want to talk about it? She asked awkwardly. At least she sounded more willing than Shikamaru to go through with it. But Sasuke was the most reluctant of the lot. Not yet, he answered. He couldn't tell her about the Mangekyo, about the Sharingan in the orange mask, about his clan yet again proving itself darker and bloodier than he believed it to be. She had been understanding until now, but she would start to distrust them for real if this went on. Just like he was. He followed her out of the flat when she left to go back home, pretexting an errand to run despite the late hour. There was no way he would be able to sleep or think about anything else. He needed to know. He went back to the Uchiha district, careful to remain discreet even if the streets were deserted already. He snuck into the temple. He lost some time and a few nails trying to unseal the covered passage to the vaults, until he found the chakra lock carved into one of the paving stones. His mother had taught him a katon that could mimic a torch out of the palm of his hand, and he used it to light his way down the cave. They had followed Shisui blindly the first time and he had decided on the spot that he would come back on his own, to better explore and snoop around. The first thing he noticed, that had escaped him the first time, were the eyes. Neatly arranged on a shelf in one of the alcoves were a dozen of ornate boxes, the ones where they kept the eyes of the deceased, to be burned when the mourning was over. It sometimes took years, but they were supposed to stay in the family's private shrine during that time, and then destroyed. He recognized a few of the names carved there, including Kamui's. He wondered if Kara knew. He had an idea why they were kept here, but he had to make sure. Maybe it was something else entirely, maybe he was getting worked up for nothing. He ignored the scrolls and books piling up on more shelves, though he made notes for later that some seemed to contain jutsu and seals he might not know. For now he was more interested in the tablet. It stood at one end of the room, propped by wood support on a stone table. Its marble was carved with kanji that seemed easy to read at first, but their meaning escaped him as soon as he focused on them. Shisui had stood right in front of it when they came, not subtle at all. That meant it could be read, one way or another. If it was meant for their eyes only. Sasuke blinked awake his Sharingan. The room was heavily sealed, he realized, the walls infused with chakra and wards that would keep intruders out. He focused back on the tablet. Some parts were readable now, the attributes and history of the Uchiha Dojutsu. It only pertained to the common Sharingan though. For the Mangekyo. He supposed it took one to know one. He wasn't used to it at all, and he wasn't sure he liked it either. The strain was heavy and uncomfortable, like walking miles with a loaded bag strapped awkwardly to his back, that he couldn't put down, that kept dragging him, weighing on his whole body. Using the Sharingan was instinctive and pleasant, he liked to keep it in his eyes even when he didn't have to, had built his stamina for this express purpose. It wasn't rare to see red eyes in the Uchiha district, for no other reason than it was natural for them, despite its chakra consumption. At times it felt more taxing to keep it away, though outside of their confine, they were careful to do so. This Mangekyo was another matter. It was demanding, unstable. Controlling it was a struggle, its power spilling out unorderly. Dangerous, including for himself. Besides, it gave him terrible headaches. But it served its purpose here, unlocking its own mysteries written on the stone. How to acquire it, through tragedies. How to make it enduring. Ah. Right. Mikoto couldn't sleep. It wasn't anything new, She could never get a proper night of rest, ever since the birth of her first son. She had grown used to long, sleepless hours then, when the clan was in a state of unrest that had her constantly on edge, fearing for her family's safety. Her sleep never recovered. Fugaku wasn't much better. They would keep each other company, reading books and reports, writing letters. Talking, sometimes, though neither of them was ever much inclined. They would play shogi or, more rarely, break out a smoking pipe filled with soothing herbs they passed between them. Getting in any form of altered state was against their instincts as shinobi, so it didn't happen often. Mikoto was smoking alone tonight. Sleep evaded her entirely. The hours passed even slower on her own. In the end, they got along well enough, Fugaku and she. It was hard to say if it was ever proper love, it felt such a distant, foreign concept, when they had all known each other their entire lives and needed to choose, come a certain age, who to be paired with. Their parents were good friends, they didn't question it too much. Why not get married, why not build their lives together? At times she had been envious of Kushina, so enamored with her husband, gripped with a passion Mikoto found alien, both intriguing and vaguely threatening. The Uchiha weren't big on such strong feelings. Kushina would press her about Fugaku and Mikoto couldn't explain how it worked for them. Feared her friend's judgment maybe, her pity. She wouldn't have been able to convince Kushina that she was happy with the life she had built. Kushina dreamed of freedom. Not unlike her son. She didn't get their sense of loyalty and kinship to their clan. Mikoto never knew if it was due to the Uzumaki not relying as strongly on these bounds as the Uchiha did, or if it was just a Kushina thing. She had been somewhat abandoned by her clan, after all. Though she never spoke of it in these terms. Kushina could never get close to Fugaku. He wouldn't let her, and Mikoto could understand why. She heard him when he said being too close to her would reflect badly on the clan, mistrusted already. It wasn't an argument Kushina could have understood, her sense of justice too sharp and unyielding. We are not doing anything wrong, she would say. Mikoto hated to have to tell her that it didn't really matter. The clan had to come first, eventually. The clan and her sons born to it. The order was a bit unclear. Fugaku had known. With time, he had come to lose sight of the distinction too, more so after what happened with Itaki and Danzo. The children needed care and protection, from the clan but somehow against it too. Her husband had been far less intransigent in the last few years. Not that anyone would have noticed, especially those closest to them. Suzuki's resentment ran deep, and they wouldn't get a shot at mending that gap. He had no idea how much narrower it was than he believed. Fugaku was simply plain unable to express it. Her words would hold little weight now. Your father was proud of you. He had hopes for your future. He believed you would do better than he did, than we all did. It wouldn't land, coming from her. Fugaku had missed all his chances. And now? She was missing him already, in the simplest way, the space in his shape and form was empty when it shouldn't have been. She wished she could ask him for counsel over what she was planning, but if he was here, she wouldn't have to. She doubted he would even approve. The irony was not lost on her. You smoke. Suzuki was taking his shoes off in the entryway and she sat in the kitchen's back door, facing the garden, in his direct line of sight. She would have made an effort to hide it from him once. She only smiled. Sometimes. Do you want to try? She chuckled at his wrinkled nose. He was still very much a child. Though the shadows in his eyes were misplaced on one his age. Where were you? Around. I'm going to bed now. Suzuki. She was pleased each time, that he still answered to her command, despite his age, despite his rebellious spirit. She wasn't yet an opponent in his mind, but something told her it might change soon. In normal circumstances, he would have offered to keep her company. Speak your mind. You can ask, if you need to. I don't think I should. Why not? You won't like my questions much. She smiled again, beckoned him closer with a wave of her hand. He was reluctant, but he complied. He wouldn't meet her eyes though. Don't worry about that. Tell me. He stayed focused on the garden, on the leaves swaying gently in the night breeze. The last of the summer warmth lingered despite October coming. They would have to bear through the commemoration of the Kyuubi attack yet again in a couple of weeks. You know about our eyes? He asked bluntly, deliberately vague. She only suspected, but this was confirmation enough. Yes. You don't. No. But your father told me. We were just married when Asahi died in his arms in the outskirts of AIM. He came back with these strange new powers. He was quite lost. It was hard for Suzuki to picture his father young, let alone vulnerable. She couldn't quite picture him anything else. In some way Fugaku resented her for that. That he could never get the strong clan head act to work on her like it did on everyone else, their sons included. He was with his brother? When he died? Yes. She understood immediately the look on his face, the doubts in his voice. She was surprised by her own anger. Suzuki. Your father had his faults, but please don't think so poorly of him. He had the good taste to look apologetic, but he didn't back down. Why not? I saw the list. I'm sure some of them urged the process along. This wasn't the conversation she expected to have with her son tonight. It should have come later, or ideally, never at all. She knew better than to indulge in this kind of thinking though. It had done them no good in the past. Besides, he was right. Among the users of the Mangekyo, they all had their suspicions as to which one could have wanted to help the fates. Which ones had the will? The doubts were there about Fugaku as well. It was laughable, but then again who, besides her, had seen him rage in despair after his brother's death, who had seen him rebel against the idea of taking his eyes, who had stopped him, in his lowest, darkest moments, to just go and follow his brother? The elders had not left the choice to him. He would take the eyes. He would secure the strength of his Mangekyo. Some did, probably. And your father didn't. Don't doubt my words. Suzuki was unsettled by her tone, as she seldom talked to him so bluntly. He nodded though, placated if not convinced. He wouldn't ask her again. But that wasn't it. Come on, don't hold back now, she urged, a tad too harshly maybe. She tried to rein in on her temper. He had warned her after all, that she wouldn't like it, and she had pressed him on anyway. You had a brother too. She startled at the unexpected question. I did. He was almost 10 years older. He died when she was a teenager. They weren't close. And they did too. The ones on the list. A lot of us. Itaki and I. She frowned in confusion, lost in his reasoning until it dawned on her. No. No, Suzuki, you're wrong. Almost all my friends are an only child. Their parents would say one was enough, that more cost too much, and shinobi are not encouraged to spend too much time away from the field. Suzuki. Why did you have 2 kids? She closed her eyes tightly, unprepared for the blow, for the pain it brought. He seemed so resigned, so sure. Maybe this is true. Maybe the tradition can be traced back to this. You read about the eternal eye, didn't you? You think we worked toward this, all this time? You think this is why you were born? Why then? Just as we grew up with siblings, we wanted that for you too. So that you wouldn't be alone in this world. Shinobi made so many orphans. This is why the clan mattered too. Had Kushina known that? Oh, it was unfair to blame it on her, as if she had any choice. But at least Mikoto knew that her sons would have each other. Do you think so badly of us, Suzuki? Of me? I don't know. I just... She pulled him to her, his teenage sensibilities be damned. He came willingly enough, proof that he was deeply shaken by all this. What did we care of the Mangekyo, of the will of the clan? We loved you so much, Suzuki, both of you. As we would have loved any other to come. Had the Kyuubi not attacked, had the clan not fallen even more into disgrace, she believed they would have had another child. It felt transgressive, it felt almost a revenge, a defiance, to grow her family far away from her duties to the village. Of course, they were expected to perpetuate the bloodline, but 3 was just excessive now, wasn't it? The clans couldn't grow too numerous, it was another thing held against the Uchiha. The civilians had more children. Children less valuable. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to use the Mangekyo, you don't have to think about perfecting it. You don't have to think of us. Father wouldn't like to hear you say that. She laughed, a pitiful, strangled sound half caught in her throat. Don't let him know. Is it that easy? I'll make it so. I'll make it so that you can choose, Sasuke. Do whatever you want. His father wouldn't have liked to hear that either. You're not serious, are you? Sometimes Karen's tone was so threatening, she sounded so pissed, that it was enough for her interlocutor to back down immediately. Suijutsu was especially susceptible to this. She would say, "You're not serious, are you?" and he, wisely, would recognize his last chance to drop his latest questionable idea. Fortunately for him, or not, Naruto's survival instinct was far weaker than Suijutsu's. Sorry. I am sorry. Saying sorry wouldn't help his case, but he did feel bad for causing her to worry, again. Are you kidding me? Didn't we just agree to no more stupid ventures outside for no good reason? The Akatsuki is on our asses, the snake is too. And in case you forgot, they just laid the fucking head of the fucking Uchiha clan in one smooth swoop. I'll be careful, I promise. I won't get caught, no one will know. I need to go. Karen had been expecting this, and so she had followed Naruto out in the forest when all the others had believed him when he said he just needed to clear his head. He didn't want to tell them, they would try to stop him, just like Karen was now. They would be right. She had brought Suijutsu along, and Naruto really hoped it wasn't because she planned on stopping him by force. What will you even do if you go there? You can't be seen, you can't approach any of them. You can't comfort your sad little Uchiha. She was trying to make him mad, and as usual doing a stellar job of it. He hated when she was right and he hated that it happened so often. I just need to check if he's alright. Then send the foxes. Karen, please. She threw her arms in the air with a frustrated cry. Yujito would have backed her up, with more success perhaps, the older men too. Which was why Naruto had tried to sneak out unknown. Karen knew him too well though and couldn't just let him do as he pleased, even if he took some comfort in the fact that she had not warned them all. Why do I even bother? Just go, you don't need anyone's permission, do you? Do whatever you want. Get locked up in Konoha's jail, or strapped to a sacrificial altar in the Akatsuki's lair for all I care. I'm sorry. Going to Konoha was a stupid idea. The Akatsuki was on the move, less concerned by the repercussion of their actions than ever, and he couldn't imagine what would happen to him if he was caught in the village. Karen was right on point for this too, they even had a cell waiting just for him. Going was stupid. And he couldn't bear not to. He had to see Sasuke. He had to see if he was alright, had to see for himself. The foxes could get in and out of Konoha easily enough, they could keep him up to date, but it didn't help his need to see. And he wouldn't be able to do anything, to talk to him, to give any comfort, yet he had to be there anyway. Sasuke was in pain, physical, emotional, he was hurting. It couldn't be the first time. Naruto was 3 years gone, Sasuke had not waited around at home since then, but Naruto had not known. He could just ignore it when he didn't know anything, when he just asked Akiko to keep an eye on his friends from time to time. How was he supposed to ignore this? It was selfish of him, it wasn't like he could do anything, and yet he didn't think he would be able to just stay here and wait. Maybe it was just an excuse. Now that the idea was there in his head, now that he had realized that he could just go and see him, in the flesh, even from afar, it would be enough. Just for a moment. There was no point, he had no excuse. He was just consumed with the thought. Suijutsu will go with you, Karen declared forcefully. I will, the boy asked, though rather unsurprised. Why? No more freaking Jinchuriki roaming around in nice little pairs. And rich boy can't be trusted not to be even worse than Naruto at this. You're going, Suijutsu, and you'll watch that idiot, or I'll beat your ass. Yeah, alright. No need to be nice. I'll go, Suijutsu drawled. Karen, Naruto tried, unable to just let it be when she was so mad at him. So disappointed. Save it. I hope it goes to shit, and maybe you'll learn this time. It won't. It'll be fine, you'll see. I'll be back soon. I don't care. She turned back without another look at him. Let's go, Suijutsu said lightly. Don't worry. She'll get over it. Naruto wasn't too sure about that. The others would be mad too. This was a terrible thing to do. And still, he went. Chapter 15. There is going to be a vote, Sasuke announced as he stepped into the Yamanaka flower shop and fell onto the last chair available, at the little table in the corner where Sai took breaks when no one was around. He didn't react to Sasuke's entrance or announcement, except with pouring him a cup of tea. It was Ino who urged him on as she kept pruning a huge lemon tree a few feet away. Really? Is that going to work? That's the usual way. What happened to fights to the death, I wonder, she mumbled under her breath. That would be the most advantageous method for you indeed, Sai said helpfully. You sure won't get the position based on your popularity. He avoided deftly the lemon she threw at his face. They can't reach an agreement, so a vote it is. Hoping everyone will accept the outcome. You think there might be trouble? I don't know. I don't know. Sasuke didn't spend much time in the Uchiha district lately. Despite his duty to his mother, he simply couldn't stand the atmosphere, the tension. Itachi was living at Shisui's place for now, too affected and banned from the hospital until he could prove to Shizune he was getting any amount of sleep at night. What are you doing here anyway? Ino asked, joining them at the table now that she was done with her work. I needed to talk. And what, Sai is first up on your list. The boy smiled, amiable. Sasuke would have felt bad about it, but Sai had proven enough time that he was perfectly aware of the jokes made at his expense, or others. He just played the fool. He could be even worse than Ino. Sakura is busy with training. For a change. And I'm avoiding Shikamaru. Really? Why? He's gotten pretty involved in Asuma's physical therapy and he has questions. Meaning he wouldn't leave Sasuke alone. It was his way of coping. Asuma would walk again, eventually, but that was all they could promise for now. Kurane was about to give birth to another subject Shikamaru had gotten passionate about. He did the same when Koji had pneumonia as a kid. It'll pass. You're welcome here in the meantime, Sai added. I appreciate your company. That means you're silent enough for him, Ino said. Huge compliment. I never complain about your talking. You'd better not. Sasuke left them to their bickering, regretting not going straight to the hospital when he bolted out of his apartment. But Shizune was no kinder to him than she was to his brother, and he was still on half shifts for the time being. Things will be fine, Sasuke, Ino said after a moment, startling him out of his thoughts. The old geezers will have a round and put the oldest and most boring one in charge, and you'll go through all of this again in a couple of years. She caught back her words a moment later, sheepish. Well, I mean, not all of it, Sorry. Sorry. She sucked at comfort. And she was wrong. Depending on who was chosen, things would go very differently for the clan. They still had their pride, some were still vexed. Are you still sad? Sai asked. I thought you didn't even like your father. Sasuke was knocked over by the calm harshness of that single question, spoken with Sai's usual polite tone, no ill intention whatsoever yet devastating all the same. Ino grimaced. Sai, what did I tell you just yesterday? No talking to people grieving. Then shut the fuck up. Sasuke could tell he wanted to argue, but Ino's glare was rather effective. Or maybe it was the slight panic in her eyes as she glanced at Sasuke briefly. Maybe she was afraid he would get upset, or, sage forbid, start to cry. They were on the same page, it was the last thing he wanted. All right, walk us through it then, she said forcefully, swiping the comment away. What are your options? He laid it down to them as clearly as possible. 3 names for now, at least, Tekka, Yashiro, and Hanma, older than the others, older than Sasuke's father, probably passed up for the role at the time Fugaku was chosen to take it on. Among his father's generation and the one just below, Tekka was one of those willing to continue working for better integration of the clan in the village, and Yashiro was the opposite. Both had a decent claim but might lack the support. The clan was still pretty evenly split over the issue, between those who mourned some former power and glory, those who feared still being too weakly established to fend for themselves, should the village leadership turn on them once more, those who believed in a more united, cohesive group, those who hoped for it. Suzuki wished the clan could be taken over by someone younger, but none had the weight and influence, none would be listened to. If he had to choose, Tekka was the best option, but he was also the least likely to get elected. He was younger, with fewer allies, and he had been close to Fugaku. Some were looking for a turnover in the leadership. Some were still clinging to independence, Suzuki was sure. That's it? Ino asked. You're sure? He nodded, not quite getting her irritated tone. She didn't elaborate. What are we talking about? They all turned to see Sakura barge into the flower shop, sending the chimes over the door in a frenzy. Uchiha politics, Sai replied, producing another cup of tea out of nowhere. His collection was impressive. Sakura made a face at the answer but still strode inside. Her arms were littered with small scraps and cut and her face was lightly bruised, the products of vigorous sparring with Hayate or Yojao. She looked satisfied enough with the results. How are you, Suzuki? She asked when she reached him. She didn't wait for an answer before wrapping an arm around his head to drop a kiss into his hair. She had been quite touchy since his return, and he couldn't pretend to dislike it, not even for show, even if it made him uncomfortable. She was confident and natural about it, as if it was simply how things were. Maybe it ought to be. Physical affection was rare in his clan, especially such casual displays. She said that maybe their troubles also stemmed from there. I'm fine, he mumbled, embarrassed still to be taken care of in such a way. Their friends didn't bat an eye though, so they moved on. He gave her the same rundown he just had. And she asked the same question. That's it. With the same expectant tone Ino had. He didn't know what they wanted him to say. How does it go then? Sakura asked, curious. None of their friends had ever lived through a change of a clan leader, but they had heard of it at least. This was all foreign to her. In short, we gather everyone, and we go stand behind the one we have chosen. People get a short while to change their mind, after seeing what majority seems to come on top. Like choosing a team to play tag, Ino supplied rather unhelpfully. It wasn't very procedural, but it was how it went. Don't the candidates make some sort of announcement? No. They're expected to have done the work beforehand. It's a rather quiet affair, Ino added. Always is with this lot. Suzuki shrugged, accepting the jab. She wasn't wrong. The Uchiha weren't much for passionate display. How embarrassing it would be to just harangue the crowd like a market seller. The candidates were known already, and they already all knew who they would support, though it remained rather secret up until the day of the vote. My father had pretty much the exact same conversation we're having with Shikaku and Choza the other day, Ino said. That's all the clans have been talking about. It was another point to worry over. The reaction of the other clans, of the commandment, of the Godame. They couldn't intervene nor have any say in the matter, but they could have all the opinions they wanted about the Uchiha's new leadership. The relationship between the clan heads was as good as it could get, and it would be all too easy to just sap it all in one go. His mother was worried too. She convened often with Kara's mother and other women from the clans, about their options and who to choose. His mother's voice held weight, both as the clan leader's wife and as a respected Jounin inspector, who had seen most of the last generation of Uchiha Genin through their first missions and the Chunin exam. She had also been more involved in the clan politics since the incident with Itaki in their youth. Suzuki wanted to ask for her opinion and input, but he felt out of his depth, and perhaps more importantly, it would be too much of a betrayal. To ask who to choose next, how to replace the one they had just lost. I don't want a new clan head, he said to the bottom of his empty teacup. Sai laid a hand on his shoulder and offered a sympathetic smile. You don't have a choice though, do you? Both Ino and Sakura hit him on the shoulder, though he looked like he didn't get why. Suzuki's first thought, as ashamed as he was of it, was pure rejection. His mother came forward, once all the other men interested had staked their claim. She put forward a claim of her own. And his immediate reaction was, that's not possible. It was though. As she said to those who started to protest, there were no rules against it. True, there had never been a woman at the head of the Uchiha clan, but that didn't mean it couldn't happen. And yet he couldn't help the feeling that it wasn't supposed to. It struck him after a moment of reflection. Father wouldn't have liked that. He would have been just as dismissive and unhappy as the men were being now. Be it for his wife or any woman of the clan. He would have found it laughable at best, offensive at worst. Father wouldn't want that. But his father wasn't here anymore. Sasuke was ashamed that it had not even occurred to him. It did make sense though. His mother had her standing, she had her people. She was friends with most of the women of the clan, active and retired shinobi alike, because she had spent some time as both. She had shadowed her husband for years on the clan's matters. That was what she had been doing, he realized. She wasn't seeking comfort, she wasn't distraught. She was building her support, and what support? She wouldn't have started a fight she couldn't win. Why would you do this, Mikoto? Hanma berated quietly, though his tone was unbecoming of the circumstances. Have you thought about the clan? I think about nothing else. What about you, Hanma? The will of our people will be heard. What will you do then? It won't speak in your favor. Then you have nothing to be so worked up about. The man took a step forward. The next moment, Itaka stood between him and their mother. His Sharingan wasn't in sight, he had no weapon. Yet the message was clear. Silence fell on the crowd, not even a breath to be heard. Sasuke was at a loss, and the look on Itaka's face didn't help settle his rising anxiety. Their mother put a hand on Itaka's arm, gentle but firm. She tugged only once. He lost his defensive stance and straightened up, but he didn't stray from her side. Let us decide, old Uroshi announced, presiding the whole affair as the oldest member of the clan. After a brief moment of hesitation, they started to make their move. But it was already decided. Uchiha Mikoto had trained almost all the children that stood next to their mother in the courtyard. The children would follow their mothers and the mothers would follow her, because she had worked for this, had been planning it for days. Who knew, maybe longer. Hushed arguments flourished everywhere between husbands and wives, fathers and children, and most of them ended the same. The women taking their sons and daughters to Mikoto's side. The men fuming, powerless. Sasuke couldn't believe he had not seen it coming. He was struggling with the very idea. His father was one thing, he had always been the clan head first, it was who he was, more than anything else. But his mother. Sasuke. He turned to her, standing strong and steady in front of a growing group of their fellow clan members. She looked different from what he was used to, closer, he imagined, to how most kids knew here. A teacher, a leader, commanding, fierce. He came closer. He didn't want her to shout. Sasuke. I am not your mother here. Do you understand? He did. She might think he didn't, that it was why he was hesitating, but he did all too well. Was she worried about his choices? As if his loyalty could lie anywhere else. He could still feel bitter about it. It was absurd, this was a far better outcome than any he had imagined, for the clan, for the village. The majority was clear, indisputable. She wasn't his mother here. And after? He took his place at her side, facing the rest of the courtyard. The result was clear. The clan has spoken, Uroshi said. Does anyone wish to dispute this claim? No doubt they wanted to, but none would dare. Infighting was the worst thing that could happen to them. The will of the group had to prevail. Then so it will be. Sasuke didn't get to approach his mother again for the rest of the day. There was a ceremony, a celebration, all rather dull and subdued, as a mark of respect both for their late leader and for those who had seen their claim rejected. That Mikoto was Fugaku's wife only made it more solemn. Sasuke wondered what he would think of this. Had he been alive, he would have hated it for sure, but since he was dead, maybe he would be pleased. The mantle was staying in their family. Since it wouldn't be Itaka, nor Sasuke, this had to be the next best thing. Many were displeased by this aspect as well, but it was too late to speak up now. The atmosphere was rather tense. Sasuke caught his mother's eyes and he had a feeling maybe she wanted to talk to him, but she didn't try, and he didn't either. Now wasn't the time. He escaped the temple as soon as he could. He went to sit on the pier, with an onigiri and a glass of iced tea, the sounds of the celebration muffled enough that he could be tricked into thinking it was actually a joyous affair. After a while, Izumi came to sit by his side. "You'll have to get used to that sort of things, you know," she said. "What, parties? Compromises? Disappointment?" "I'm not disappointed. Or at least, not in the way she thought." He was happy for his mother, and he was a bit reassured about their future. "You'll never get everyone to agree peacefully on the same thing. I can still hope for a more unified decision, can't I?" He was exhausted in advance on how much work it would take to convince those who weren't, all the talking and pacifying his mother would face in the months, maybe years to come. With very little being done in the meantime. "Did you know? My mother. Did she tell you before?" "Ah. Yeah. She didn't tell me." It was a little childish to get hung up on that, but he just couldn't make sense of why. Why she would keep it from him. "What would you have said, if she did?" "What?" "I don't know. That's not the point." "I think it is. Maybe she didn't want to be swayed. I wouldn't have been against it or something." "Are you sure?" "I don't know. What would it change anyway? She wouldn't have listened to me." "Are you sure?" Suzuki huffed in frustration. Izumi let out a soft laugh and ruffled his hair gently, apologetic. Sorry. I'm not trying to make you feel bad. But try to think about it from her side. Mikoto and Fuyugaka were not alike. She does listen to you." There were things Suzuki had hidden from his mother specifically because he knew that she would not approve. And if she didn't approve, it would be harder for him to go through with it. She didn't have to forbid it, it would be less effective even. But if she didn't like it, he wouldn't have told her not to go through with it. He wouldn't have dared, it wasn't his place. But he wouldn't have been pleased, and she'd have known. Was that enough? He couldn't imagine having such an influence on his mother's decisions. "Do you want to go back?" Izumi asked after a long silence. He shook his head. "I'll go for a walk or something." "I don't, she has better things to do for now than to deal with me." He left without letting Izumi say what she thought of that statement. The last thing he wanted was to be a burden to his mother. She had more important things to worry about. He knew how that went. He walked to the end of the training field, the limits of the Uchiha district. The small woods hid the outer walls of the village, the trees high enough to hide it completely. To make it look like if he just walked without stopping, he could get elsewhere, he could escape it all. In truth, he would meet the red wall after just a few minutes. The nearest gate was further east, and guarded. Not against anyone leaving, but it would still raise questions, still be noted. There were training posts and gears scattered on the field, mostly used by the children after school. He fell into position, lowered his stance, raised his fists. The post was well worn by the dozens of young shinobi who had hit it repeatedly. The wood was stained with old blood on some spots. He kicked at it first, as high as possible, though he wasn't warmed up enough and it pulled at his thigh muscles, promising some soreness the next day. He kicked again, up to his head. He was flexible for his age, he wanted to keep it that way. Stay flexible, stay in shape, stay alert and strong. No weakness, no break. He kicked the post, again, as he had done hundreds, thousands of times before, the movement well known and well practiced. He thought about Lee, who had done 10 times more. He was doing better these days, going on missions, on top of his form during training, even if he was still medicated and followed closely at the hospital. They had done a great job with his surgery. The Sharingan had been an invaluable help then. It was probably the first time it was put to this use. His father had been less than impressed, but then again, was he ever impressed by anything? Maybe this would have done the trick. Would he be satisfied with this outcome? Congratulations, son. You saw me die and gained much from it, you and your brother. I was worried I would have to kill one of you myself to make it happen. Suzuki moved to using his fists, hitting the post one hand after the other, wondering if he could go to 100, 500, 1000. If he would feel any better if he did. Keep training, so that you may not die next time. Should he have trained more? He wasn't strong enough to save his father. But then again, he didn't want to. He didn't want to train and train, he didn't want to fight. He had rebuilt Li's shattered bones from nothing. Wasn't that enough? Was it his fault? That's what he meant to ask his mother, but he didn't have the courage. Or maybe he already knew the answer. Had he been stronger, had he trained more? It was all they were good for. Train, don't die. Maybe it was his responsibility to be as strong as possible, regardless of what he wanted. He hit the post. Again. Maybe with one more, it would be enough. With one more, he would defeat his enemy. With one more, his father would live. Blood stained the wood. His vision was blurry. Just one more, and he could stop. It would be enough. One more. Stop it, stop. He ignored it, whoever it was. He wasn't sure he heard right and he couldn't see a thing. Maybe they weren't talking to him. Sasuke, stop. Someone grabbed his arm. He had the reflex to push them away, annoyed with their meddling, but they kept trying, tugged at his shoulders, his clothes. Stop. Get off me. Getting into a fight seemed like a fantastic idea just about now. Until Sasuke turned around to grab at some collar and came face to face with Blue Eyes, a head full of blonde curls and whiskers carved into tan skin. Face to face with Naruto. In and out. No one would see him, he wouldn't talk to anyone. He would just check, get a look, and get the hell out of the last place in the world he was supposed to be in. Suijutsu was waiting for him outside the walls. Akito got him in, sealed in a scroll, as they were used to do now. In and out. Not a word. He found Sasuke training on the outskirt of the Uchiha district. A common sight, he was known to train at any time of the day and night. He said it helped him sleep. He was close to the woods, Naruto could get a little closer. There was no one else around. A little closer. He noticed the blood first. The tears, second. When he realized that he was doing the stupidest thing possible, he had already grabbed Sasuke's waist to hurl him away from the training post. His friend spun around, ready for a fight. Stopped dead in his track. Naruto was so freaking stupid and Karen was going to behead him, if Sasuke or someone else in Konoha didn't get to it first. What? What the hell are you doing here? I came to check on you. Are you kidding me? He and Karen would get along great. Or they might hate each other. I know I shouldn't, it's just, I heard what happened, I was worried, I figured. I just wanted to see if you were, alright. Yeah. You came here? You dare, you think you can just show up here? You. Sasuke's hands went to his face and he seemed surprised to find it covered in tears. He rubbed it hastily, embarrassed. Naruto had no idea what to do. This wasn't supposed to happen. Naruto couldn't face him, not yet, it was. Why? What? Why would you do that? I told you, I was worried. Oh yeah? Why? There was blood on his face now, from his opened knuckles when he had tried to wipe the tears away. He looked enraged, beside himself with fury. But he was also drained, exhausted. Hurting. Naruto wasn't making it any better. We're friends, you know. Do I? Sasuke. Save it, shit, I can't. I can't, what are you even? How could you come here, seriously? How can you just show up and tell me? To both their horror, the tears resumed their course down Sasuke's face. He slammed his hand on his eyes, to hide or to stale the flow, or both. Naruto took a step forward, raised a hand, stopped. He was overcome with the urge to touch, to dry the tears, to ease the pain, and also convinced that nothing he could do or say would have the power to do that. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I didn't mean for you to see me. Is that supposed to make it better? Have you just been coming all this time? Are you just mocking me? No. Then why have you come? Karen must have known it would go this way. She always seemed to know. She was always right, and he never listened. I wanted to see you. And you just do what you want. There was so much bitterness in Sasuke's voice, Naruto had a hard time handling the recrimination, the anger Sasuke bore for him specifically. It was stupid of him to be so surprised. He was so stupid. He should never have come. He was not welcome here and Sasuke didn't want to see him. Why would he? Naruto was long gone. I don't. I heard. I'm sorry about your father. I wanted to make sure. If you need something, or... I don't need anything. From you, or anyone. I can do it on my own. Sasuke's eyes got lost somewhere in Naruto's back, his anger broader now, less focused on the boy in front of him. That didn't make it any better. I can do anything. I can win any fight, I can best them all. I can protect this place, I can become Hokage. There's nothing I can't do, I can do everything and I... He choked around a sob, his breath shortening with every word. He had given up on staving off the tears now freely crowding his scrunched-up face. I can't talk to my father. Naruto was unfamiliar with this loss. Sasuke was too. They were new to this. Naruto didn't know what to do. He never even had a father. I can't talk to my father. I want to. But I can't. I'm sorry. I can even talk to you. I can bring you back home. I can forgive you. But I can't talk to my father. Naruto crossed the distance and took Sasuke in his arms. It only occurred to him after the other boy clung to his shirt that they had never hugged before. But what was he supposed to do? Sasuke was crying. Naruto didn't want him to. What was he supposed to do? Sasuke cried, Naruto held on. He was warm and heavy in his arms, alive and raw, Naruto could barely contain it all. He couldn't stay here. He had to leave as soon as possible, this was too dangerous, but he couldn't move at all. As long as Sasuke was here, as long as Sasuke didn't push him away. It happened soon enough though. Sasuke wasn't one to forget himself for long. He pushed, he stepped back. He looked even angrier now that some of his sorrow was spent. Naruto wanted to escape his judging eyes, but he found he couldn't look away. You have no right to be here. You have to leave. Naruto could at least be grateful that he didn't try to call anyone for now. Yet he was always greedy. Now that he was here, it was hard to just turn back, to leave it at that. Are you sure you're okay? Don't ask me that. He had to leave. He was making things worse, he had to leave. He pressed on. I know you're mad, but... Mad? You think I'm mad? He certainly wasn't not that. You laid your seal on us. You just... Didn't we leave you alone? Didn't you do what you wanted, from the start? We would have let you go but you had to go and make your threats, you had to curse Sakura, and me. We're friends. How? Since he was a complete fool, Naruto had hoped it wouldn't come to be about that. I had to. No you didn't. You didn't. He really didn't. Or well, he didn't have to go about it that way. Gaara had been critical enough, but Naruto needed them to stay away, he needed to be sure. He'd figured it would be fine, in the end. It wasn't like he expected, or wanted, the seal to be of use. Sasuke ran a hand on his face again, this time to get rid of his turmoil, to put his composure back together. He was calmer when his eyes fell on Naruto again. Take it off. What? Take it off. If you meant anything you say, take your seal off. Naruto couldn't do that. Naruto, please, just take it off. It's not needed. Please. Sasuke had not asked much of Naruto, throughout their life. Naruto struggled to remember if he had ever granted any of it. I can't do that. Sasuke seemed genuinely shocked by that. Hurt, disappointed. Fine. Fine. Okay. Please go. Wait, No. I can't. It's just as well. I can't deal with it. My father is dead, I have to. I have things to do. And you do too, apparently, so just leave me alone. I'll do the same. There's no point in dragging this out, you've made your choice. I need to stay focused on what I can do. So leave it. Forget about it, forget about us. Do your things. Get lost. Naruto opened his mouth and closed it over a dozen replies. I'm sorry. I don't know what to do. You said you could forgive me. You said you would wait. The possibility was alive in Naruto's mind, a future where all would be resolved, where he could come back here without fear nor regret, and Sasuke would be waiting, and all would be fine. But he had pushed his luck. Karen kept telling him he couldn't have it all. Sasuke left. He just vanished, the whisper of a Shunshin the only thing left in his wake. It was Akiko who urged Naruto back into the scroll and on the other side of the wall. Suijutsu was still waiting at the same spot when Naruto came through, trying to look unbothered but clearly restless with nervous worry. All good? He asked, falsely casual. Naruto had no idea what face he was making, what emotion Suijutsu could decipher there. He didn't answer. We're done here. Let's go. It sounded very final. When he woke up the next day, Sasuke wasn't completely sure he hadn't dreamed up the whole encounter. He'd gone home and succumbed to the reprieve of sleep immediately, and by daylight the feelings battling their place in his heart were very different. He berated himself for his poor reaction, he should have reacted at all. Should have told someone, given the alert, done something. Instead he'd just cried and begged and laid his heart bare, only for Naruto to spear it open, again. Or seal it. Maybe this was just as well. His father kept saying he should focus on more important matters than his missing friend, that dwelling on a reunion that might never come was a waste of time and brain power. Maybe that was one advice Sasuke should follow, one wish to grant his father. There weren't many else he could live up to. Did something happen? Sakura asked as soon as they met outside the Uchiha district. No. Are you sure? You alright? Yes. Don't lie to me so blatantly. Stop fucking asking then. That cut their interaction short for the day. Sasuke wandered the village, listless and angry. He had to do something, but he had no idea what. Had to talk to someone, but had no idea who. It was insane what influence Naruto could still have on him. From so far away, with so few words and time, Sasuke was in shambles and he didn't know what to do with himself. There was no way he could tell Sakura, or Shikamaru, or his mother or brother or anyone at all. He didn't want to give this to anyone. He was already regretting some of the things he had said. He should have. He didn't know. He should have made it last longer. When would they get another chance? Next time it would go better, right? Just like his next conversation with his father would go better. Next time. He should have kept his mouth shut about the Demseal. Naruto had been here. Right in front of him, in the flesh, solid and real. Close enough that they could touch, and they had. Sasuke should have held him back. But he was so mad, and heartbroken, and lost, and Naruto was so cruel, to appear like a charm in such a moment and to still have the gall to lie, to spew out words and feelings he couldn't follow through with actions, to pretend to care and still vanish again. Maybe it had all been an illusion really. The Mangekyo had a strange hold on his mind, he was having fretful dreams full of strange worlds and shapes. Maybe he was just going insane. As usual when he didn't know what to do, Sasuke's feet led him to the hospital. He knew all the nurses, all the medicnen. They knew him as well, they offered quick condolences, but the work was never ending and there wasn't much time for sentimentality. It was a relief. Sasuke got lost in the work. Never ending, and also thankless, the chakra spent, the wounds bandaged, the medicine handed out, it was on to the next patient, more or less agreeable, more or less grateful. Sasuke liked the monotony of it, the mundane necessity. It changed the world of those who passed between their hands, but otherwise it was a trivial revolution. One after the other. One thing made better. They were quickly gaining a reputation throughout the country, and their neighbors too. Wasn't that a worthy accomplishment? He debated seeking Sakura out and offered to buy her diner, as an apology for their earlier spat, but he had no more idea of what he should say to her than he did in the morning. It would be hypocritical to apologize to her if he was going to lie in the same breath when she asked what had gotten him so upset. He couldn't imagine telling her about Naruto's visit. What would be the point, except enrage her more? He was long gone already. He didn't want to go home to the Uchiha district. Their house would either be crowded or stark empty, and he had a feeling his mother was balancing between two extremes, of wanted him as far away from her maneuvers as possible, and right in the middle of it. Staying away took the choice out of both their hands. Sasuke didn't know what he wanted either. He had to avoid Shikamaru because he would know something was up. He would just take one look at Sasuke and he would know. It was infuriating that Shikamaru, for all his lack of people skill and sensitivity, was tuned into the Uchiha Sasuke broadcast 24/7. He said Sasuke was just that easy to read, but that wasn't true. Sasuke was a model Uchiha in that regard at least. Shikamaru was just annoying like that. That left him with the hospital. Work, and more work. He had to be sneaky about it, lest Shizune caught him doing overtime and banned him from the building again. He had become quite good at hiding from her and at getting help from some of the nurses. The ones that weren't too afraid of Shizune's wrath. Or maybe the others just agreed with her. He crashed after the longest shift he had managed to pull off to this day, exhausted in the way that made it hard to think, to feel at all. Exactly what he needed. The next few hours were spent drifting in and out of a fretful sleep in one of the break rooms. It wasn't the light or the noise or an irate nurse shaking him so that they could take the spot that pulled him out of it. It wasn't anything of note. She didn't make a sound nor tried to touch him. Her presence was enough to stir him up, quiet and unassuming as it was. Sasuke blinked the sleep out of his eyes to stare at Hinata's blank face. She handed him a coffee and a steaming bun stuffed with red bean paste. She was alone, for once, bundled in an old beige coat he had not seen her with in a while. She looked young like this. Cold too, in every sense of the word. The sunlight was bright. Were they so far into the day already? Her pale eyes glowed in the harsh light. She talked before he could. Did Naruto come to see you? He choked on a mouthful of coffee and barely avoided spitting it all on her. It drew the faintest smile on her face, a rare sight. Beautiful and sad, she had always been both, ever since they were kids. Kiba would always goof around and be annoying, but it was obvious watching them that he did it for her sake. Whether she found him genuinely funny or just wished to indulge him, it worked to brighten her face, if only briefly. So it was all worth it. That's, why do you ask? I spotted someone in one of the gardens last night. I only caught a glimpse, but I would recognize him. She seemed completely unconcerned by the event, yet she had sought him out here, just to talk about it. She couldn't be that indifferent, and did she know him so well, remember him so well? They would meet in the woods, Sasuke remembered. Stay in the same vicinity in silence, without a look or even a nod of acknowledgement, yet Naruto would count it as them hanging out together. And what made you think he would have come to me? She raised an eyebrow, confused. Why else would he be here? She made it sound so simple. Such an obvious, easy truth, when it was everything but. Or was it? Sasuke was lost. He said he was worried. He wanted to check on me. That's nice. He didn't understand her at all. Is it? Would you rather he didn't come? You got to see him. I wouldn't have wondered. I didn't even consider it. Really? I thought about it all the time. She looked away, a little thrown off by her own confession, a slip she didn't mean to let past her lips. He never indulged in that kind of thinking. Maybe he had fantasized at times, about opening his front door just to see Naruto standing on the other side, but his friend was gone for a reason. He didn't do things by halves. It's not like it was going to happen, he said, dismissive and a tad too condescending. She frowned. I know. He winced at her hard tone. Of course she knew. The details were a little unclear, but Neji had left on worse terms with Hinata than Naruto did with them. She had told Sasuke once, in the end, you managed to let him go. He could only guess she didn't. Not that it made a difference. Or it did, because Naruto had come, after all, He had come despite it all and Sasuke didn't know why, couldn't make sense of it. It was unfair, it was cheating. Why did they suffer so, if they didn't have to? If Naruto could just walk back in and out of his life so easily? But then he doubted it was any easier to bear for Hinata, knowing that there was no chance, that this bridge had been burnt. Yet if Naruto had gone through the trouble of checking on her. Of course Naruto and Neji and all these people with them, they lead their lives, outside these walls. They had their own struggles and thoughts, their own journey, they had to deal with these feelings too. Who knew what they talked about, why they did the things they did? Who knew if Neji had known about Naruto coming, if he had been waiting outside the walls, or if he was none the wiser? These questions could quickly eat away at them. Was that why Hinata wanted to talk it out with him? So that the thoughts wouldn't drive her mad, turning and turning in her head with no way out? Do you think we're wrong? He asked after an awkward pause that made him want to spill his most amorphous ideas for some reason. That we should stop. I think it is irrelevant. Why? Because I couldn't anyway. She sounded perfectly resigned to it, but she leveled him with a curious gaze. Could you? He wasn't sure if he caught a hint of disapproval. Or envy. I guess I'm thinking about trying. Again he couldn't tell if she was betrayed or understanding, if she approved or resented it. It shouldn't have mattered as much as it did, so what if he wanted to at least try to protect himself from further heartbreak, try to let go of something that had brought him nothing but pain for years now? Maybe he wouldn't even be able to. But he could try out of sheer spite, just to show that he could, that there was more to him than just waiting and longing, than just hoping for something that was getting further and further away from his reach. Naruto could do whatever he wanted. He would be the one to do the work, if he wanted Sasuke to give him another chance. That was only fair, right? He didn't dare ask her. Then again, they were the same, but they really weren't. She carried more guilt, and more responsibilities too. And there was even less she could do about it. Sasuke racked his brain for something he could do for her, anything to ease the burden, to lend her some support, however small. Do you want to meet my mother? Her wide eyes clued him in how weird this was out of context. He fumbled with his words, embarrassed. I mean, you must know she has been chosen as our next leader. She would be happy to meet with you, I'm sure. He thought about what this could have been as she nodded shyly, little pleased smile making her look less solemn. Thought about bringing someone home one day to meet his mother, not his father, not anymore. He would need only her approval then. If it ever came to it, if he ever needed to introduce someone to her, though it seemed silly, unrealistic. I would appreciate it. Thank you. Ah. Hinata was gone again, the leader of the Hyuga clan was back. It was an ongoing mission between all of the friends, to try and coax her out more often. But Hinata herself was resistant to the play. Maybe the Hyuga clan leader didn't suffer as much. We can go now if you want. All right. After all, Sasuke needed to go home, eventually. Check the description for the links to the author.